The void remembers. It remembers the prayers whispered into broken helmets, the dreams crushed beneath the thunder of orbital fire, the tears that turned to dust before they ever touched the soil of Terra. In this place between light and darkness, between devotion and despair, the legend of one man has been reborn, not as myth, but as a weapon sanctified by pain. They said he was a mortal once, a creature of shadow, a knight who fought not for glory, but for the faintest echo of justice in a city that had forgotten the sun. But when the Imperium swallowed the stars, and the name Batman became nothing but an ancient whisper, his spirit endured. It was not the man that survived, it was his will. And in the cold eternity of the 41st millennium, will is a kind of divinity. Before we descend further into this forgotten faith, remember to join us so that our stories may never fade into silence. The hive was dead, but it did not know it yet. Beneath mountains of ash and steel, the city still breathed, slow, ragged, and poisonous. The manufactorums coughed their final smoke into the blackened air, and the spires stood like gravestones against a starless sky. Vox towers crackled with ghost voices, transmitting sermons from priests long since burned away. Somewhere below, in the drowned cathedrals of the Underhive, men still prayed. To the Emperor, to fate, to anything that still might be listening.
And sometimes something listened. He came in silence, a block silhouette against the glowing slag of the lower decks, armor matte and ancient, moving like the shadow of a memory. No heraldry marked his plates, no purity seals, no chapter sigil, no imperial aquila. Only the faint, worn outline of a broken bat etched into the ceramite chestplate, half erased by centuries of war. They called him the Black Vigil, a ghost, a demon, a fallen angel of the Emperor. To some, a lie to frighten heretics, to others, a myth to comfort the hopeless. Yet to those who saw him, who felt the tremor of his footsteps through the steel bones of the hive, he was something else entirely. Proof that faith might still walk among them, silent and unyielding. He moved through the corpse of the city with ritual precision, each step measured, each breath, if he still needed to breathe, a silent litany. The faint hum of the power armor was his heartbeat. The smell of promethium and rust hung around him like incense. In the distance, a manufactorium burned, its towers collapsing into the abyss. The flames were orange, almost holy in the dark. "Forgive us," whispered a voice through the vox static, a human voice, trembling, broken. "Forgive us, O Emperor, for we failed you." The vigil turned his head slightly, the lenses of his helm glowing a faint blue. He found the source, a wounded guardsman pinned beneath a wreck of a chimera, body crushed from the waist down. The man's lasgun lay inches from his trembling hand.
The vigil knelt beside him. "I'm not the Emperor," came the voice, low and metallic through the vox grill. The guardsman laughed weakly, blood bubbling from his lips. "Then what are you?" The vigil did not answer. He simply reached forward, and with one precise motion, pressed his gaunted hand over the man's chest. A quiet hiss, a shimmering of light, and the pain ended. The man's head slumped forward, peaceful. A mercy kill, a benediction. He rose without a sound, eyes lifting toward the broken sky. Somewhere above, thunder rolled, the sound of drop pods or orbital bombardment. It no longer mattered which. The city was condemned. He continued walking, his boots echoing against the steel as he descended into the lower levels, the veins of the hive. Down where the air thickened with oil and dust, down where the people whispered prayers not to the emperor, but to shadows. They had seen him before, in flashes, a dark figure on the edge of a firefight, a shape pulling children from collapsed hab blocks. The heretics feared him, the ecclesiarchy denounced him, but the desperate lit candles in his name. In a world that worshipped death, a symbol of silent protection had become heresy. He reached a junction where rusted pipes formed a cathedral of dripping iron. There, beneath the flicker of a broken lumen strip, he paused. A small shrine stood at the center, crudely built from scavenged metal. At its heart, a fragment of ceramite, blackened and carved with the mark of the bat. Around it, votive candles burned, flickering like dying stars. Someone had left offerings, food, trinkets, a child's toy cogitator. A prayer etched into the floor in low Gothic, to the Watcher in the dark. Guard our souls when the light fails. He stared at it for a long time. The candles guttered. His reflection shimmered faintly in the metal. Towering, monstrous, inhuman. Yet behind the armor, behind the centuries of war and silence, something faint stirred. Not memory, but the echo of it. He reached out, brushed his fingers over the carved words. Then from the darkness above came the sound of motion, metal scraping, the quick, animal breaths of men. He turned before the first bullet hit. The gang emerged from the shadows, clad in scavenged flak armor and faithless rage. Scavers, underhive scum, the detritus of the Imperium's forgotten. They carried makeshift weapons, stub guns, chain blades, flamers patched with scrap. Their leader stepped forward, a scarred brute with augmetic eyes that glowed sickly red. "Well, look at that," he sneered. "One of the Emperor's golden corpses come to die in the dark." The vigil said nothing. "Take him apart! The Mechanicus'll pay for that armor!" They opened fire. The corridor exploded in muzzle flash. Bullets pinged harmlessly off the ceramite. The vigil didn't move at first. He let the first wave come, the sound, the fury, the hatred. Then, with the grace of a creature long accustomed to violence, he moved. His gauntlet snapped a man's neck. His knee crushed another's chest. The sound of bones breaking echoed like hymns. The leader raised his flamer, but the vigil was already upon him. One swing of his arm, and the man hit the wall hard enough to break it. The flamer fell, leaking promethium across the floor. The vigil turned, ignited the weapon with a single spark from his armor's exhaust vent, and flame roared through the tunnel. The gang vanished in a storm of light. When it was over, the silence returned, thick, suffocating, absolute.
He stood amidst the burning corpses. The shrine's candles had all gone out, only smoke remained, curling like black incense into the rafters. He stared at the ruin, at what he had done. He knew this ritual well, the cleansing fire, the penance of violence, the endless loop of justice and death. It had no end, no redemption, only repetition. And yet he continued, because someone had to, because if he stopped, the darkness would win. From far above, the vox crackled again. A voice, not human this time, but metallic, layered, inquisitorial. Unregistered Astartes presence detected in Hive Disolium. Identity unknown. Possible heretic origin. Inquisitorial strike force en route.
He looked up at the ceiling. The sirens began to wail. The vigil turned, and for the first time in years, he felt something like weariness. He whispered through the vox, so softly that only the dead could hear it. I am vengeance. I am duty. I am no one. Then he vanished into the smoke. The hive's alarms echoed like a dying cathedral's bells, and somewhere deep below, the people began to pray again, to a shadow that neither answered nor slept. The light faded, but the prayer continued. The storm above the hive thickened. Lightning crawled through the smog like veins of angry light, splitting the clouds that had not known daylight in centuries. Through the fractures of the sky, orbital fire fell like the judgment of forgotten gods. The vigil moved through the maintenance corridors, the echoes of the sirens fading behind him. Every passage was a grave. The walls were lined with corpses, some human, some servitor, each locked in their final act of labor. The scent of burnt flesh mixed with the sweet metallic rot of machine oil. He walked among them as one might walk through a cathedral. To him, every body was a prayer cut short. Every rivet in the steel walls was a relic of devotion. The Imperium had built these hives as monuments to order, but to the vigil, they were tombs. Tombs that still breathed. He found the service lift at last, half sunken in grime. The control panel was shattered, its buttons long fused by heat. He pried the doors open with a motion that spoke more of weariness than effort, and dropped into the shaft. He fell for 7 stories before landing in silence. Down here, there was no light, only the faint blue gleam of his armor's optics and the whisper of distant machinery. His boots sank into oil and ash. Pipes overhead wept black water. The world felt as if it were rotting from the inside out. Then came the whispers.
At first, they were only echoes, distant, indistinct. But as he moved deeper, they sharpened into words. Children's voices, prayers in low Gothic. Watcher in the dark, keep us safe. Watcher, don't let the fire take us. He followed the sound until he reached a narrow chamber carved out from the old hab levels. There, huddled in the dark, were the remnants of a family, 4 children and an old woman, her hands folded around a rusted rosary. When they saw him, they did not scream, they only fell to their knees. The eldest girl, perhaps 12, lifted her chin and said in a trembling voice, "You came back." The vigil stood at the threshold, towering and still. His armor was scorched,
his lenses glowing faintly through the dust. "I did not come for you," he said, his voice a low tremor through the vox grill. The girl smiled faintly. "You always say that." Her words pierced something he thought long gone. He took a step forward, the servos in his greaves humming softly. "You know me?" he asked. "We see you," she whispered. "When the lights go out, when the enforcers stop coming, when the gangs take the bodies. You walk in the dark. You take the fear away." The vigil said nothing. He looked at the children, thin, hollow-eyed, faces painted with soot. He turned his head. Somewhere above, he heard the rhythmic thunder of approaching boots, the Inquisition strike force, methodical and merciless. He could not stay. He reached to his belt and pulled free a small power cell, setting it on the ground beside them. "This will keep your light burning for a week. When it fades, go deeper. There's an aquifer beneath the lower levels. Follow the pipes marked with red." The girl nodded, eyes wide. "You'll come back?" The vigil paused. Then, after a long moment, "If I can." He turned and vanished into the tunnels before the words could become a promise. Behind him, the children's voices rose again in prayer, not to the Emperor, but to him.
And though he told himself he did not believe, a part of him, the small, fragile remnant of the man he once was, wanted to. The tunnels widened, giving way to the ancient foundations of the hive. Columns of rusted adamantium held up a ceiling blackened with centuries of soot. He followed a narrow path that led to an abandoned transit line, its nag rails half buried beneath debris. There, among the wrecks, a broken servitor stirred. Its torso was fused to the train's hull, wires spilling from its chest like entrails. One red optic still glowed, flickering with corrupted data. "Identify self," it croaked. The vigil knelt beside it. No identification. No designation. No chapter. The servitor's voice faltered, static bleeding through. "Purpose. Purpose." He looked into its single flickering eye. "Justice," he said. The servitor spasmed, its failing cogitator humming as though trying to comprehend. Then it fell silent, the last light in its optic fading to black. He reached into the shattered circuitry and extracted a single data shard. On it, faint signals pulsed, coordinates encrypted. He inserted it into the slot in his vambrace. The display flickered across his helm's visor. Ecclesiarchal Basilica, Upper Hive, Priority Purge Site. The Inquisition was not here to cleanse the heretics. They were here to cleanse the symbol. Him. The vigil rose, his gauntlets clenched, the servos whirring with restrained power. He turned toward the upper levels. If they wanted to burn a myth, he would meet their fire with truth. It took him 3 hours to ascend. The elevator shafts were blocked, the lifts dead. He climbed instead, his armor scraping against the corroded rungs, the hum of the hive around him growing louder with every level. When he emerged at last into the mid-hive, the air was thick with incense and blood. Enforcer corpses lay scattered across the streets. Above, the spire of the basilica glowed like a dying sun. Great banners hung from its walls, bearing the imperial aquila and the sigil of the Ordo Hereticus. The inquisitors had already begun their purge. Columns of flame rose from the lower cathedrals. Servitors dragged bodies into the square, stacking them into pyres. Preachers screamed of purification while the crowd watched in hollow silence. The vigil moved among them unseen, his armor's shadow field distorting his presence. He passed through the scent of burning flesh and old incense, through the tears of penitents who no longer remembered what they had done wrong. Then, amid the smoke, he saw her, a woman in crimson robes, her face half hidden beneath a gilded mask of faith. Inquisitor Marin of the Ordo Hereticus. He had known her once, in another lifetime, when she was still mortal, when she still believed that mercy had a place in this galaxy. Now she stood upon the steps of the basilica, a flaming sword in her hand, preaching to the damned. Sin, she cried, is the luxury of the faithless. The Emperor's light burns pure, and all who defy it shall burn with it. The vigil felt the faintest echo of sorrow. He had seen her soul once, bright, defiant, unbroken. Now it was just another weapon. He stepped into the open. The inquisitors turned as one. Voxes flared. Lay's fire screamed through the air. He raised his hand, and the world became thunder. The blast wave from his gauntlet sent the first rank flying. He advanced, unhurried, a walking monolith of shadow. Bolter fire tore through the square, the echoes deafening, but he kept walking. His armor took the hits, his stride unwavering. Each step was a heartbeat, each movement a prayer. When he reached the base of the basilica steps, Marin's voice broke through the chaos. Who dares stand against the Emperor's judgment? He looked up at her. I do. The words were not loud, but they cut through the noise like scripture. And for a moment, just one moment, the flames faltered. The Inquisitor's eyes widened. Beneath the mask, recognition flickered. It's you, she whispered. The vigil raised his gaze to the burning banners of the Aquila above. Faith built this empire, he said softly, but fear keeps it alive. The Inquisitor's blade trembled. Then you are the enemy, she said. The vigil bowed his head. Perhaps. Then the world erupted into light. The explosion tore through the square like divine thunder. Fire swallowed the statues of saints and martyrs, melting their marble faces into a river of grief. The air screamed as Prometheum tanks ruptured, the shockwave tearing through stone and flesh alike. Through it all, the vigil stood unmoved, wreathed in ash and flame, a dark figure amidst divine ruin. His cloak burned away, his armor gleamed like obsidian beneath the inferno. The vox grill of his helm hissed with static, a low growl like the dying breath of a god. Above him, the basilica's bell began to toll, slow, broken, mourning its own destruction. When the light cleared, the inquisitorial retinue was gone. Only Marin remained, kneeling amid the ashes, her gilded mask cracked down the center. The heat shimmered between them like a veil. "You should not exist," she said. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but conviction. "You are a lie. The Emperor's will has no need for shadows." The vigil took a step forward. The ground beneath him hissed with molten glass. "Then why," he asked quietly, "does the Imperium live in them?" She raised her sword. Its flame sputtered weakly, dying in the wind. "You call yourself righteous?" "No." His voice was low, almost human. "Humanity is a luxury I could not afford." Marin's eyes glistened. "Then you are damned." "Perhaps," he said, turning away. Behind her, she fell silent. The flames receded into embers, leaving only ruin. Above the basilica's shattered spire, the sky was beginning to crack, the artificial storm peeling away to reveal the cold glow of orbit. The Inquisition would not stop. They would call him traitor, heretic, abomination. They would send custodians if they had to. It did not matter. There was still one more thing he had to do. He walked through the ruins of the basilica's inner sanctum. The great stained glass windows had melted into twisted ribbons of color, like the veins of some wounded god. The altar lay shattered, its relics scattered like bones. In the center of the chamber stood a single figure, a servitor monk, still reciting scripture despite the inferno. Its vox crackled, voice repeating the same line again and again. "In his light there is no shadow." The vigil stopped before it. For a moment he listened. Then he knelt and laid a hand on the servitor's bowed head. "There must be," he murmured. With a soft pulse of energy, the servitor fell silent. Its red optics dimmed. He rose again, scanning the ruined hall. His helm systems flickered, briefly revealing echoes of the past, heat ghosts, data phantoms, residual memory imprints from the basilica's walls. He saw priests burning heretics, soldiers kneeling in penance, children pressed against the altar rail, eyes wide with awe and fear. And through it all, he heard it, the hum of a voice he had not heard in millennia, deep, resonant, eternal. The Emperor's. Or perhaps only his mind, fracturing under the weight of silence. "You cannot save them all." "I know. Then why do you try?" The vision faded. The cold returned. He stepped forward, his armor creaking under centuries of burden, until he reached the throne at the heart of the hall. Once it had held a cardinal. Now it held only dust. He sank to one knee, resting his gauntlet upon the cold marble. For a moment, he let the silence consume him. The air tasted of ash. The light from above cast his shadow long across the floor, split by the broken symbol of the Aquila. One wing bathed in firelight, the other in darkness. He looked at it and almost laughed. "Balance," he said softly, "even now." A sound broke the silence, the faint hiss of a servo door opening. He turned. The children, the ones from the tunnels. They stood at the threshold, faces streaked with soot, eyes wide with a kind of holy terror. The girl at their front held the power cell he'd given her, now dim and flickering. "You found the way," he said quietly. She nodded. "You said you'd come back." He looked around the ruined basilica, at the corpses, the ashes, the still burning altars. "There's nothing left for you here." She took a step forward. "Then where do we go?" He hesitated. For a heartbeat, he almost said Terra, but the word felt heavy, chained, cursed. Instead, he said forward. She frowned. "What's there?" "Hope," he said, though even he didn't believe it. He reached down, pressed something into her small hand, a fragment of the bat insignia from his chest plate, cracked and scorched. "Keep it hidden," he said. "It's not holy, it's just a reminder." "Of what?" He looked past her, toward the horizon, toward the dying light struggling through the smog. "That even the dark can protect the light." Then he turned away, his armor whispering against the stone as he walked toward the shattered gate. The children watched until he disappeared into the smoke. Outside, the hive burned. The inquisitorial banners fell one by one, carried off by the storm winds. The flames painted the sky in gold and blood. Far above, the orbiting ships of the Inquisition shifted position. No bombardment yet, only the waiting silence of judgment. And somewhere within that silence, the vigil's voice echoed through the vox, faint and fractured. "I am the watcher in the dark. I am the last light that does not burn." Then the signal died. The children looked up at the sky, at the falling ash that glowed like dying stars. One of them whispered, "He'll come back." The girl said nothing. She only clutched the broken insignia to her chest, eyes glinting with reflected flame. Outside, the storm began to fade. The light waned, but the prayer continued. At dawn, if such a word could still be used in a sky that had forgotten the sun, the hive tasted of iron and incense. Smoke drifted in pale veils down the transepts of the mid-hive thoroughfares, and the bells of the ecclesiarchy tolled like wounded lungs. Word of the Black Vigil's blasphemy had already spread along the Hab levels, a contagion of whispers, passed from cracked lips to trembling ears. An Astartes without sigil, a guardian without sanction, a shadow that dared answer the emperor's silence with an oath of its own. Confessionals swelled with bodies. Penitents lined the basilica steps in chains, heads bowed, backs marked by the careful geometry of scourge lines. Vox grills in the nave rattled with sermons recorded long ago, their voices blown thin by static until every syllable sounded like a prayer chewed to gristle and forced down.
The priests spoke of purges and cleansing flame, of the mercy of annihilation, of the kindness of pain. They told the crowd that doubt could be burned out like rot, that fear would evaporate if heated enough, that the emperor who had never blinked would never forgive. But the people did not come for mercy. They came to be told where to kneel.
Along the perimeter of the square, squads of the Astra Militarum stood at uneasy attention, las-gun-shouldered, uniforms ash-paneled by the night's inferno. They were not here to be saints, they were here to be proof that order still existed, that bodies could still be arranged in straight lines, and the chorus of "Yes, Commissar" could still be sung on command. Between the guardsmen marched Adeptus Arbites in black carapace, mauls idle at their hips, visors blank as altar slate. Somewhere behind them, the robed silhouettes of the Ordo Hereticus glided like red knives in a sheath of incense. The rumor moved through them all like a cold wind. The Inquisitor had faltered upon the basilica steps. The Shadow had named fear as the Imperium's cradle. The statue of Saint Canoness Verena had cracked down the center as if grieved. In a side alley, narrow as a blade, a man with a bandaged eye stood waiting his turn to confess. He was a manufactorum rigger, hands scarred with cogwheel teeth, mouth stained by solvent. He had seen the Shadow twice, once lifting a falling crane with a single gauntlet, once setting a sobbing child into his arms without a word. He had not prayed to the Emperor in years. The Emperor had not answered. But last night, when the vigil had walked through fire toward the basilica steps, the rigger had felt something old stir in his chest, something with a voice so small he might have crushed it if he dared. He wondered if that voice was blasphemy, or if blasphemy and hope were simply two names for the same wound. He reached the confessional grill at last. On the other side sat a confessor whose face was lost behind a curtain of smoke. The rigger tried to speak the litany. The words snagged in his teeth. "Father," he said finally, "what if a shadow can keep us safe?" The confessor's reply came flensed of warmth. "Shadows shelter vermin." "What if the light burns children?" A pause, a slow exhale. "Then the children have been judged." The rigger felt the old voice in his chest recoil, then sharpen. "And if the judge is wrong?" "Then faith must be stronger than truth," the confessor said, and pulled the lever that released the lash from the booth's wall. Outside, a preacher mounted the fractured plinth of Saint Canoness Verena and raised a relic that might once have been a finger, now gold-dipped and hollow. His words rose thin and bright, a flame-starved torch, obedience, duty, cleansing. For a few breaths the crowd listened as they had been trained to listen, with their backs. Then someone began to hum. It was not a hymn from any sanctioned codex. It was a low, breath-warmed sound like a lullaby sung to a frightened hablock at shift's end. One voice, then 3, then 20. The tune was older than conquest. It had crossed oceans in blood-stained ships long before starships learned to make the jump. It spoke of keeping watch when the lamps failed, of a hand on a child's shoulder that did not ask to be thanked. The preacher faltered. He called for silence. The Arbites advanced, mauls raised, and the humming dipped for a heartbeat, but did not end. At the edge of the square, Inquisitor Marin watched from behind a veil of crimson. The crack in her mask had been sealed with a line of aurolite, straight as a wound that refused to scab. She listened to the hum, to the refusal inside it, and for an instant remembered a field hospital on a nameless agri-world, where she had bound the stump of a guardsman's arm and whispered, "Live." before the sigils and the words carved into her bones, before conviction had calcified into law. Her acolyte leaned near, parchment rustling. "Permission to disperse, Lady Inquisitor. An example will cauterize this song." Marin's gaze slid over the square and found the rigger with the bandaged eye. He had knelt, but it was the kneel of a man lowering a body onto a pallet, not the kneel of a man bending his neck to the axe. She saw in him a cathedral's worth of sins, the tenancy of doubt, the theft of unsanctioned comfort, the housing of hope in a chest unblessed. She also saw the way his shoulders shook when the humming rose, the way his hands curled as if to catch a child who might fall from a burning stair. "Not yet," she said. "Let them sing." Her acolyte stared, confused. Law did not contain space for watching. Marin did not explain. It was not mercy. It was measurement. She needed to see the shape of this contagion, to map the veins it used. She needed to know whether the vigil's shadow was a single blasphemy or the first line of a creed that would thrive precisely because it could not be written down. Above the square, a hololith flickered to life on the basilica's outer wall, its projectors coughing sparks. An image swam into focus, the imperial aquila, then the face of a cardinal whose teeth looked too numerous for a human mouth. He spoke in a rain of benedictions that sounded like knives dropped point first onto a stone floor. He promised absolution for those who denounced the vigil. He promised bread for those who burned shrines that bore the broken bat. He promised that the Ordo Hereticus would tear the darkness from the hive with loving hands and leave it pristine as a newborn skull. As the promises fell, the rigger lifted his head. His hum faltered. The old voice in his chest whispered, "Not believe, remember." The two words were not the same thing. He remembered the vigil's hand on a girder holding a weight it did not owe. He remembered the tiny nod that said, without grammar or liturgy, "Live." He remembered a symbol that was not holy and therefore could not be profaned. A column of guardsmen moved to break the crowd for processing. Their sergeant's bionic jaw clicked with the rhythm of orders. One of the soldiers, young, gray-eyed, a recruit smelling of bootblack and fear, hesitated at the sight of a girl clutching a scorched scrap of ceramite to her chest. She did not run. She simply stood with the kind of stillness that sometimes survives fires. "What's that?" he asked, voice trying for command and finding curiosity instead. "It's a reminder," she said. "Of who? Of what we ask of the dark."
He might have laughed, or reported her, or taken the scrap and thrown it onto the smoldering pyres where the ecclesiarchy burned unsanctioned relics until the smoke tasted of old secrets. Instead, he looked up at the basilica, and for a heartbeat, the statue's cracked face seemed almost to be listening. Orders barked, the line moved, the girl vanished into the fold of bodies, and the young guardsman felt the surprising weight of something he could not name sit down beside his heart and refuse to leave. In the alleys beyond the square, augured cherubs spiraled like steel moths, their picked capture lenses drinking the faces of unbelievers. On a rooftop, a lone figure watched through a helm of midnight glass. He had not yet left the hive. The vigil stood in the wind that reeked of burnt parchment and wet stone, and considered the calculus of survival that the day demanded. He could scatter the square in seconds. paint the flagstones with law, or he could do nothing and let the song decide what needed deciding. He did what the bats of his first life would have done. He watched. The hum sank into the city's pores. It found the spaces between the scriptures and filled them with breath. It did not promise victory. It only promised the possibility of standing upright for one more minute. Sometimes 1 minute becomes a religion. Down in the square, Inquisitor Mirren lifted a hand. The Arbites halted. The bells fell quiet. The crowd held its breath as if the hive itself might inhale and extinguish them like candles. By mandate of the Ordo Hereticus, Mirren said, voice amplified until it trembled in the bones, the shadow is named. It will be hunted. It will be severed from this world like a tumor. But hear me, children of Terra's law. If your fear wears its face, confess. If your hope wears its face, beware. The hololith flickered, the aquila glared, the humming thinned to a thread. On the rooftop, the vigil turned his helm a fraction, catching a distant signal on a band he did not use. A whisper meant for machines, not men. A summons buried beneath a canticle. It came from the catacombs under the basilica. The old city was calling its own dead. The vigil stepped back from the edge, vanished into the stairwell, and the door sighed shut as if relieved to hold a secret again.
The light trembled, but the watch continued. The catacombs were alive, not with motion, but with memory. Each corridor murmured in tones of rust and sorrow, the endless whisper of prayers that had lost their tongues centuries ago. The vigil descended through the cracked stone, through stairways built before the Imperium had even named its own cruelty. Here the air was colder, purer, unfiltered by doctrine. He passed frescoes so ancient, their pigments had bled into one another, forming rivers of color that no longer belonged to saints or sinners. In some, the emperor's face was painted whole, unburned by divine light. In others, he was just a shadow among men. The vigil traced a gauntlet along the wall as he walked, and the dust clung to his armor like a benediction. At last, he reached a vault sealed by chains of gold and prayer script. The sigils were old High Gothic, banishment runes, words meant to keep the warp itself at bay. Yet the lock bore a newer scar, a cut clean through the purity seals, melted by plasma. Someone had opened this place before him. He entered. Inside, a single lumen flickered. It revealed an altar draped in torn cloth and a lectern piled high with fragments of scripture, each burned halfway to ash. The scent of incense lingered, sweet and cloying, too recent to be a ghost. And then, from the shadows, "You should not have come here." The vigil turned. A figure stepped forward, robes of crimson and steel trailing like a broken comet. Inquisitor Mirren removed her mask. Beneath it, her face was lined not by age, but by the weight of belief. Her eyes, once gold with zeal, now dimmed like dying candles. This place was sealed by the Synod centuries ago. It was built to hide words that could unmake faith. The vigil studied her, his armor's systems pulsing faintly in the dark. Then why break the seals? Because I needed to know. She wavered, confession warring with command. Her gaze fell to the texts. These scriptures, they speak of men who walked with him before the throne. They say he loved them, that he mourned them when he ascended, that perhaps he did not want godhood. Blasphemy, the vigil said softly. Yes, she whispered, and yet it feels like truth. He stepped closer, the weight of his armor pressing into the silence. Truth is not a weapon meant for mortals. Then what is faith? She asked. A comfort for the obedient? A leash for the lost? He looked past her to the altar. Faith, he said slowly, is the light we carry into places where truth cannot follow. Merrin's lips parted, perhaps to argue, perhaps to pray. But before the words could leave her, the vox in her ear burst to life. Contact, Inquisitor! The heretic asterate is in your sector. All units converge. Her expression faltered. She stepped back. They think I'm luring you. Aren't you? I don't know. Outside the chamber, the distant roar of lasfire echoed through the catacombs. The vigil's helm flared to life, tracking signatures. Dozens of heat blooms moving fast through the catacombs. He reached for his weapon. Go. Merrin hesitated. They'll kill you. He looked at her, and though his visor hid his eyes, she felt the sorrow within. Then they'll prove their faith. The vault door trembled as explosions began to hammer the outer passage. Stone rained from the ceiling. Merrin turned and fled into a side corridor, her robes vanishing into the dust. The vigil waited.
When the breach came, it was like the tearing of heaven itself. The first inquisitorial shock troops poured through, purity seals fluttering like torn wings. He met them head on. The first blow shattered 3 men at once, their armor folding like paper beneath his gauntlet. He moved without hesitation, without rage. His violence was sacred geometry, each motion a line in an invisible scripture. Law's fire seared against his armor. Bolters roared. Frag grenades painted the air in flame. He did not falter. When the smoke cleared, only silence remained. The catacombs' walls dripped with ash and light. The vigil stood amidst the ruin, motionless. His breathing echoed in the helm like a confession. He looked down at the bodies, their faces frozen in faith. I am sorry. I have seen too much good die for the sake of holiness. Then he turned and saw something written in light upon the altar. A fragment of text, revealed by the heat of battle. Ancient script burned into the stone itself. In the end, he will not rise above us, but beside us. For divinity was never meant to rule, it was meant to remember. The vigil stared at it, the meaning heavy as gravity. He did not understand. Perhaps he never would. But something within his mind, something older than gene seed and armor, stirred. He deactivated his weapon and knelt. Not to worship, to listen. Far above, the basilica bells tolled again, though no hands pulled their ropes. The echoes reached the surface, spreading through the hive like a pulse, through churches, through manufactorums, through every man and woman who had whispered the vigil's name. And for the first time in centuries, faith and fear began to sound the same.
Inquisitor Marin emerged into the open light of the upper hive, breath shuddering through the vox of her rebreather. The world above was chaos, banners aflame, the Arbites retreating, the ecclesiarchal guard firing into the air. "They're saying the catacombs burned," an officer shouted. "The heretic is dead." Marin said nothing. She looked up at the basilica's highest window, where the smoke rose in black ribbons against the gray dawn. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow move through it, broad, winged, and silent. She whispered, "No, not dead." And somewhere deep within the ruins below, a voice answered her, not through vox or faith, but through the stone itself. "Not yet." The sound rippled through the hive like a heartbeat beneath the earth. Citizens looked up from their prayers. Guardsmen hesitated at their posts. Somewhere in the dark, the hum began again. The same low tune that had once filled the square, now spreading through the tunnels like water. Marin lowered her head. The auramite seam across her mask caught the faintest light. She whispered, "No, not destroying faith. He's rebuilding it." The acolyte beside her frowned. "In whose name?" She closed her eyes. "In ours." The wind shifted, carrying the echo of distant footsteps, heavy, patient, unbroken. And in that sound, the hive found its new prayer. The light dimmed, but the shadow endured. The hive never slept again after that day. Every hour brought a new rumor, a new scripture scrawled in soot on the walls. The priests tried to wash them away, but the words returned each night, phrases written by trembling hands, half remembered from dreams. The watcher walks. The dark remembers. Justice is mercy when the light forgets. The Arbites tore down hundreds of heretic scribes, but more rose in their place. They called themselves the Vigilant. They did not kneel. They did not fight. They only stood guard at crossroads, doorways, and broken altars, whispering their creed. When the light burns, the shadow guards. It began as rumor. Then it became movement. Then it became faith. The ecclesiarchy declared it blasphemy. They called it a cult born from despair, an infection that confused rebellion with piety. They sent fire and scripture to purge it. But fire cannot burn what already lives in the dark, and the dark began to answer back. Deep beneath the hive, among the dripping walls of the catacombs, the vigil walked again. His armor bore new scars, his steps slower now, heavier. The battles had not broken him, but the silence was beginning to too. He no longer received inquisitorial pursuit. The Ordo Hereticus had withdrawn, perhaps by command of Marin herself, or perhaps because the faith of the people was shifting too fast to cage. Above ground, sermons now carried his name, spoken with venom or reverence, depending on who you asked. He ignored both. He walked among the forgotten dead, old imperial soldiers, unmarked martyrs, saints no one remembered. He carried with him the fragment of scripture he had found at the altar, etched now into the inside of his vambrace. He will not rise above us, but beside us. The words gnawed at him. They contradicted everything he had been built to believe. The Astartes were the Emperor's angels of wrath, carved from human flesh and reforged in divine obedience. He had once believed in hierarchy, in purpose, in the chain of command that led upward toward godhood. But what if divinity was not a throne to ascend, but a burden to share? He did not know how to pray anymore. His voice was too heavy with guilt. Still, in the depths of the hive, he found himself whispering, not to the Emperor, but to the idea of him. "I tried to save them," he murmured into the silence. "But they worship the fire more than the warmth it gives." The echo came back, quiet and cruel. "Then give them shadow." He froze. For a heartbeat, he thought it was his mind unraveling again. But the air shifted, the sound of a presence that did not belong to this world. A hum of unseen energy, like the warp brushing against the edges of reality. From the darkened archway ahead, a light began to bloom, a sickly gold that pulsed like a heartbeat. He raised his weapon. "Who speaks?" The light grew, and within it, a figure formed, a silhouette of armor, radiant and cracked, its every plate marked with the aquila. Its face was featureless, save for the faint lines of a man's sorrow. When it spoke, its voice carried not through air, but through the marrow of his bones. "You have made faith without permission." The vigil stood still, his pulse slow. "Who are you?" "A remnant," the figure said, "a reflection of his will, a thought that remembers obedience." The vigil's helm tilted. "A custodian." "No, older." For a moment silence, save for the dripping of water and the distant hum of the hive above. The figure took another step forward, and the air rippled with power. "You were not meant to endure. You were born for war, not worship. You are a weapon that dreams." The vigil's gauntlets clenched. "Then why do I remember love? Why do I remember mercy?" The figure's voice softened. "Because even weapons rust. Even blades bleed when they've been swung too long." "I saw the Emperor," the vigil said quietly. "I saw his light turn men to ash. I saw them burn and call it salvation. He gave them what they asked for. They did not ask for peace." The vigil lowered his weapon. "And you, what do you ask for?" The figure turned its hollow gaze toward him. "To remind you of your place." Then it struck. The light exploded into motion. The vigil blocked the first blow, the force shaking the tunnel walls. The impact sent a shockwave through the catacombs, shattering ancient bones into dust. He countered, swinging his gauntlet like a thunderbolt, his fist connecting with divine armor. Sparks scattered like dying stars. The figure staggered, but did not fall. They moved like mirrors of the same pain, divinity and defiance intertwined. Every strike was scripture, every parry heresy. When the final blow came, it was not strength that decided it,
It was choice. The vigil disarmed his foe, tearing away the weapon glowing with sanctified flame. He raised it high, ready to strike, and stopped. The figure's cracked faceplate reflected his own visor. For a moment, he saw himself not as warrior or myth, but as man. He lowered the weapon. I will not kill another prayer.
The figure faltered, its light dimmed. Then, almost tenderly, it whispered, "Then you are already lost." The golden light flickered, then imploded into silence. When it was gone, the vigil stood alone. His armor was cracked, his mind a storm. Yet in that silence, something within him felt clean. He turned his face upward. Above him, through kilometers of rock and ruin, he could almost feel the sun. He imagined what it might look like if the smoke ever cleared. Above ground, Inquisitor Merrin stood in the ruins of a chapel overlooking the lower hive. The air carried a strange stillness. Even the constant clatter of machinery seemed to have hushed. She felt it, a pulse, faint but vast, like the breath of the planet itself. Then the bells began to ring. Every church, every shrine, every vox tower across the hive, tolling not in order, but in chaos, not by command, but by memory. And for the first time in 10,000 years, no one knew who they were ringing for. In the depths, the vigil began to walk again. His armor was damaged, his steps uneven, but his will unbroken. He passed through the catacombs where the air shimmered with the dust of the divine. He did not look back. As he moved, the vox crackled softly in his ear. Merrin's voice, faint, almost lost to static. "Where are you going?" He answered, his tone low, steady. "Where they still dream. The ecclesiarchy will call you a devil. Then let them. Devils are just angels who remember mercy." He continued walking until the light of the surface began to bleed through the cracks in the stone, a dim, polluted dawn struggling to exist. He emerged into it slowly, the first rays striking his broken armor, turning it gold for just a moment before the soot reclaimed it. The city below stretched endless, its towers still burning, its people still praying. But now, in the ruins, there were other prayers too. Soft, wordless, honest. He knelt at the edge of the platform overlooking the abyss, the wind howling through the skeletal remains of the hive. And though he knew no god would answer, he whispered anyway. For every world that falls, let one child live. For every light that dies, let one soul remember why it shone. The vox crackled one last time. The hum of the hive deepened, resonating through the steel. A voice whispered, one he had not heard since Terra itself still bled. Rise, dark night of mankind. The night is long, but you are not alone. He rose, and the darkness rose with him. The light faded, but the faith endured.
Terra spoke in dust. It rose from the flagstones of the Sanctum Imperialis like the ghost of a broken oath, drifted along corridors lined with statues whose eyes had been cut from stone so they could not witness the failure of men. Pilgrims crossed the plazas on blood-polished knees, lips cracked by recitation. The air itself tasted of incense and old iron, of a world embalmed while still alive. Above it all, the mountain of palaces climbed into the bruise-colored sky. Tier upon tier of worship hardening into bureaucracy. Bureaucracy ossifying into law. The vigil had not set foot here since the dreams of his first life had finally drowned.
He came veiled in anonymous ceramite and penitential ash, a pilgrim among millions. His armor was shrouded beneath sackcloth that stank of promethium smoke. Purity seals, borrowed, not believed, fluttered over plates pitted by wars that Terra had never deigned to notice. He moved like a shadow that had learned to be humble, head bowed, vox silent. In this city, noise was sacrilege unless sanctioned. He had not come to kneel. He had come to remember what kneeling meant. The processions funneled him through bronze gates taller than titans toward the choir courts, where administratum clerks bled ink in labyrinths of parchment, and the adeptus custodes watched with predator stillness from behind their gold. The vigil kept to the edges, where the shadow cast by a single column could cover 100 souls. He matched their rhythm, step, whisper, sign the aquila, kiss the cracked mosaic of an angel's heel. He did as they did until belief and mimicry were indistinguishable. Beneath the flagstones, his helm's auspex mapped the arteries of the palace, maintenance tunnels, forgotten corridors bricked over by policy, sealed reliquaries whose guardians had long since become part of the dust they inhaled. The signal he hunted pulsed from far below, a sporadic heartbeat coded in frequencies older than High Gothic, older than the throne's current song of needles and death. He had captured it on Hive Desaleum, a scrap of machine psalm buried under Marin's command bands. It had kept time with the bells of a world he could not save. Now it kept time with Terra's. He turned from the river of worship and slipped into a maintenance cloister, where the lamps flickered, their machine spirits fasting. Here, the walls were close, whispering with the rub of robes and the scrape of boots that had hurried when they should not. A cherub droned overhead, oily wings beating. The vigil stilled and watched its optics drift past, red as a remembered wound. When it was gone, he shouldered aside a grate more carefully than any door he had ever breached in war, and dropped into a throat of stone that had forgotten the taste of sunlight. The breath of Terra changed. Down here, the city smelled of coolant and vellum, dust and candle soot, the spiced breath of parchment that had outlived empires. His boots rang once against a rung, and the sound seemed to go on forever, passing itself from arch to arch like a secret no one wished to keep. He followed the signal through a geometry of neglect, past ossuaries where saints and clerks were stacked together, bone-labeled in copper tags, past archives sealed by prayers that had lost their grammar, past a mural of the emperor blessing a child, the paint
flayed by a knife in a hand that had trembled. His mind catalogued each relic the way it had once catalogued enemy fortifications. He had killed less for more. At last he came to a door without a door, only a wall mortared over, newer than 1,000 years than those around it. The signal beat from behind like a moth trapped in honey. He set a gauntlet against the stones. They were warm, as if history were a fever. He could have smashed it. Terra would not feel the bruise. Instead, he prayed to nothing in particular, that subtlety might be grace, and slid a cutter from beneath the pilgrim's sackcloth. Its whisper was a penitence, careful and intent. He took the wall brick by brick, replacing each stone on the floor as though laying a careful corpse out for viewing. He worked until the last layer crumbled under his fingers, and the gap sighed with a long-held breath. The chamber beyond was lit by a single lumen that had not gone out in a millennium. Its flame burned low and blue, eating oil that had been consecrated when Terra still remembered weather. Shelves slept under the weight of codices, bound in leather darker than sin. The air quivered, the small vibration of a machine soul praying without witness. At the chamber's heart, a device waited like a wound sealed with gold. It was not of Mechanicus make. Its lines were too merciful. An altar cogitator, the color of old bone, wrapped in a nest of fiber-optic veins that pulsed to the rhythm of the signal beckoning him home. Script ran along its edges in a hand both delicate and ruthless. Letters formed by someone who had loved words enough to weaponize them. He knelt, not to the machine, but to the choice before him. He had learned that kneeling was not surrender, it was calibration. When his fingers met the surface, the cogitator woke with the softness of a pulse felt at a throat. Lenses dilated. Keys revealed themselves like teeth in a careful smile. The lumen steadied as if relieved. A voice spoke, not through his vox, not into his mind, through the room. It said, "Query," in a tone that made the word a sacrament. Identity. He considered the hundreds of names men had nailed to him. Heretic, angel, vigil, Batman in a world that no longer had bats. He answered with none of them. I am penitent, he said. The machine paused, as if translating humility. Accepted. Script bloomed across a panel in letters cut with light. He read. At first the words were only language, and then they were history, and then they were accusation. They spoke of the unification wars as a hymn with a hidden verse. They spoke of the emperor not as a god, but as a man who had chosen to shepherd monsters, because the alternative was to let the monsters shepherd themselves. They spoke of a project whose code name had been erased from every archive but this, an attempt to graft into certain warriors not only flesh and fury, gene seed and obedience, but also an angle of conscience. To cultivate in a few weapons the disease of doubt, that they might turn it upon the guilty with precision, rather than upon the innocent with flame. A marginalian note carved deep by a blade. If angels must be made, let one remember why men are worth saving. He felt the room tilt. Beneath the shock,
Recognition uncoiled like something that had slept under his ribs for centuries and finally stretched. The vision in the basilica, the murmur in the catacombs, the relic's cruel line. He will not rise above us, but beside us. The pain of mercy, the fatigue that no battle ever cured. The way his violence had always felt like a tool forced to do the work of a hand. Designate, the cogitator intoned, gentle as a confessor. Project designation.
He mouthed the old word that was not a word. The room listened. Watchman. Silence. Then, softly, as if embarrassed by its own persistence, status aborted. He closed his eyes. He saw surgical theaters under black banners, saw Gene Wrights with cracked lips, saw the order come down like a blessing in a language only knives understand. Aborted, not erased. He was standing in the place where the attempt had been mourned, not where it had been denied. He opened his eyes. The cogitator displayed names struck out with care, dates burned to vitrified glass, coordinates of battlefields that had become reliquaries. There was no list of survivors. A reflection moved in the polished bone. He turned. Across the threshold, a shadow had settled, tall and patient. Oromite gleamed like a star denied the sky. A custodian stepped into the chamber and closed the ruined wall behind him with a motion like a benediction. "This place," said the warrior of the throne, voice low as a mausoleum's promise, "does not exist." The vigil rose without haste. Dust fell from his sackcloth like a tired absolution. "And yet," he said, "here we are." The custodian inclined his head a fraction. "You are an error given time." The vigil looked at the altar cogitator, at the gentleness engineered into its shape, at the cruelty hammered into its function. So are you. The custodian's halberd whispered from his grip, "Walk away from this. Forget the door you opened. The Emperor requires instruments, not mirrors." The vigil's vox hummed with a breath that might have been laughter. "I was made to remember." For a heartbeat, Terra held its breath. The lumen flame trembled, then steadied, as if choosing a side.
Some choices are a battle before the first blow falls. The vigil set his hand on the altar, as though on a shoulder. "Then we must both serve," he said, "as we were made." Steel hissed, stone listened. The dust waited to see which oath would add its weight to it. The light thinned, but the shadow did not move. The silence between them was holy. It was not peace, but the kind of silence that exists between lightning and thunder, the held breath before revelation. The lumen flickered weakly, casting the custodian's armor in liquid gold, turning the vigil's own blackened plates into the outline of an eclipse. Two children of the same empire, born from opposite ends of faith. The custodian was the Emperor's sentinel, eternal, incorruptible. The vigil was the Empire's mistake, faith without permission, justice without orders. "You kneel in places forbidden to man," said the custodian. His voice was a storm under iron restraint. "And you read what the throne buried for our protection."
I only read what the dust allowed, the vigil replied, and the dust remembers everything. The custodian took a slow step forward. His halberd sang softly as it moved, the sound pure and sharp, like a blade being prayed over. Do you know what happens to men who mistake memory for revelation? Yes, the vigil replied. They become saints or ghosts. The custodian's helm tilted faintly, intrigued. Which are you? The vigil's visor reflected the dying lumen. I was meant to be both. The custodian lunged. The blow was like a meteor. The halberd slammed into the altar, cracking the stone into a storm of dust and sparks. The vigil moved with impossible precision, ducking beneath the arc, his motion guided not by calculation, but by instinct forged in endless war. His gauntlet struck the custodian's pauldron, sending the golden warrior reeling backward with a sound like breaking bells.
They circled one another, weapons drawn, faiths clashing in silence. The custodian's every movement was ritual, perfect, ordained. The vigil's every strike was improvisation, feral, human. You defy divinity, the custodian said, parrying another blow. You walk in shadow and call it grace. The vigil caught the halberd's shaft in his hands, forcing it aside. If divinity demands blindness, then I'd rather see. The custodian's eyes, hidden beneath the lenses of his helm, flared faintly. You see too much. I see enough to know what your emperor has become. For a heartbeat, both froze. The custodian's voice lowered. Mind your tongue. He burns on that throne, his soul stretched between machine and godhood, neither alive nor merciful. And you keep the machine alive. You feed it men. You call it holy because the truth would break you. The custodian's halberd wavered, only slightly, but it was enough. The vigil stepped forward, pressing the blade aside, his voice no longer a weapon, but a whisper. You feel it too, don't you? The silence in his light, the absence that feels too vast to be divine. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, the rasp of filters, the faint hum of armor cores. Then the custodian lowered his weapon. You think I do not doubt, he said quietly. Every day I walk among 1,000 statues that do not blink. I stand guard before a god who cannot die and cannot live. I have watched the greatest warriors in history offer their souls to ash. And still I remain, because faith is not sight. Faith is choosing blindness. The vigil's helm inclined, and blindness has built 1,000 tombs. The custodian looked down at the cracked altar where the cogitator still pulsed faintly, its machine spirit trembling in the air between them. That device, he said, you should not have touched it. It was the Emperor's failure. I know, the vigil answered, and yet it remembered me. The custodian turned his gaze fully upon him now. You are watchmen. The word carried weight, not spoken as a name, but as a confession. I thought none survived, the custodian said. Your kind were purged before the heresy. The project was abandoned, too dangerous. Compassion without command is chaos. Compassion, the vigil murmured, is the only thing that makes command worth obeying. He stepped closer, their armor almost touching. You were made to protect the Emperor's flesh. I was made to protect his dream. Tell me, which still breathes? The custodian's jaw clenched beneath his helm. The dream has become too costly. Then maybe it was never his dream at all. The words hung like incense smoke between them, heavy and inescapable. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the custodian deactivated his halberd. The weapon's light faded, leaving only the lumen's flicker reflected in his armor. You will not leave this chamber alive, he said softly, but not because I wish it, because the palace itself will not allow it. The vigil glanced at the walls, at the inscriptions burning faintly with ancient wards. Then let the palace remember me. You misunderstand, the custodian said. It already does. And then the stones began to whisper. From the cracks in the floor, faint blue light seeped, lines of circuitry older than the Imperium, awakening after millennia of stillness. The runes on the walls ignited in cascading fire. The chamber was no longer a room, but an eye opening. The vigil looked up and saw faces in the flame, hundreds, thousands, warriors like him, lost and forgotten, some burned by plasma, others frozen mid-prayer. Their visors reflected eternity, but their bodies were gone. Your brothers, the custodian said, the first watchmen, buried beneath the throne when the Emperor chose perfection over pity. The vigil felt his knees weaken, not from fear, but from recognition. He buried them alive. They asked to stay, to watch over him, to keep the dream from fading. But the dream became a tomb, and they became its bones. The light swelled, filling the room. The faces turned toward him, not accusing, not pleading, waiting. Why show me this? The vigil asked. Because you are the last question the Emperor ever allowed. The vigil stared into the burning faces. In their silence, he saw not death, but endurance. The same stubborn defiance that had kept him walking through war after war, long after purpose had crumbled. He took a breath that tasted like smoke and old prayers. Then I will not let their question die. The custodian's hand tightened around his weapon, but he did not raise it. And if you are wrong, then let him answer. The vigil stepped forward into the center of the light. His armor system screamed in protest as the energy seared through him, the circuitry of the ancient machine merging with his own. Symbols blazed across his chestplate, rewriting themselves in fire and blood. Somewhere above, deep in the throne room of the Golden Palace, the Astronomicon flickered. The Emperor's light, the beacon that guided all ships through the warp, stuttered. For a single impossible heartbeat, the light dimmed, and on every world where men still prayed, the stars seemed to blink. When the glow finally faded, the chamber was silent again. The altar was gone, the lumen extinguished. The custodian knelt amid ashes that still smoked faintly of sanctity. The vigil was nowhere to be seen. Only a mark remained on the stone floor, a symbol burned into the rock. Not the aquila, not the sigil of the watchman, a bat. The custodian bowed his head. So it begins again. Outside, far above, Terra's dawn broke, but the light felt colder than before. The sun rose. The shadow followed. The first to notice with a blind. Choir psychers chained in vaults beneath 1,000 cathedrals stiffened as if a hand had brushed their crown. Their mouths opened in soundless cries. The Astronomicon had not gone dark. Such an ending would have been mercy. It had faltered, like a lung that remembered drowning. For the span of a single heartbeat, it was human, and the galaxy heard that weakness like thunder rolled in a child's chest. On Terra, the wind changed. Banners that had not stirred in an age shivered along the parapets of the Sanctum Imperialis. In the Hall of Indices, quills snapped on the same syllable in 1,000 different ledgers. At the Lion's Gate, a custodian paused mid-stride and looked toward a sky floor he had guarded since before history learned to say his name. No one spoke. Across the mountain of palaces, silence moved like a slow blade. Inquisitor Merrin stood at the edge of a balcony where the world ended and the throne's shadow began. She had rushed there at the first rumor, robes whispering like a wound making excuses. The seam of auramite across her mask caught the wan light of dawn and reflected it at an angle that made even truth look necessary. Below her, pilgrims pressed to the gates as if they might stop the tremor in the heavens with their knees. A boy lifted a strip of scorched ceramite to the light and smiled as if a god had written him a letter. "Report," she said to the Vox. Her voice sounded smaller above Terra than it had in the hive. "Momentary interference with the Astronomicon. Stability at 99.9 repeating. No threat to navigation. Cause unknown. Recommend increased devotional output in all choirs." "Cause," repeated Merrin, letting the word taste her. "Unknown." She closed the channel. Below the balcony, the air smelled of oil, vellum, and the iron that never quite left old blood. Somewhere behind her, a mechanic priest sang to a generator's machine spirit in a language that sounded like grief cut into gears. She turned toward the palace, toward halls where she was not welcome, and doors that opened only for men whose minds had been whittled to a single point. The vigil was gone. She knew it the way a battlefield nurse knows a pulse has decided not to return. Yet the city felt full of him, the shade cast by a column too narrow to make shade, the hush that followed a prayer too honest to be legal. He had been here, in the bones, in the dust, in the forgotten arteries of a palace that confused endurance with eternity, and Terra would not forget the taste of him. She descended the stair, each step a negotiation with memory. On the 6th landing, she met a custodian. He stood with his helm under one arm, golden as regret. Up close, his face was carved with the humility of those who have learned that perfection is simply patience without witnesses. He looked at her auramite seam, at the crimson that meant she had turned her soul into a document, and he inclined his head
as a man might to a patient who has learned the name of her pain. Inquisitor, he said.
Warden, she replied. They did not exchange names. Terra ate names. She felt it, she said. Not a question. Yes. What did he do? She asked, and heard the plea in her own voice like a foreign accent. The custodian's gaze moved past her, toward a horizon no eye could own. He asked a question. That's all? Once, that was everything. He closed his eyes. Do not go where he went. Even we avoid those arteries. Memory runs too hot there. I've been burned before. Not like this, he said. It almost sounded like mercy. She thought of the altar cogitator that did not exist, of letters bitten into bone with a blade that loved what it cut. She thought of the project no archive could accuse, of watchmen buried beneath a mountain that called itself a man. She thought of the boy on the steps below holding a broken bat to the light as if testing whether it could bear weight. What happens now? She asked. The custodian set his helm back upon his head. The click was a sacrament. Now the throne remembers that it has a shadow, and men remember they can stand in it without going blind. He stepped aside. Go do your work, Lady Inquisitor, whatever you decide it is. She passed him without bowing. On Terra, piety and refusal often kept the same posture. In the lower courts, she found a chapel with its door ajar. Someone had entered in a hurry and then forgotten how to leave. Inside, wax had melted into hieroglyphs along the floor. A single votive still burned, its flame bent slightly, as if listening. Merrin knelt on stone rubbed smooth by unquestioning knees and took off her mask. She had dreamed once of a god who bled with his people and did not ask how thickly. She had traded that dream for law, because law had a calendar and grief did not. Now the calendar had stuttered, and grief had raised its head to see if anyone remembered it. I don't know how to pray to a wound, she whispered. The candle did not answer. Behind her, in the nave, a penitent coughed blood into a cloth and folded it the way a mother folds a blanket. Merrin set the mask at her side as one might set down a weapon that had begun to talk back. And for a long time, she listened to nothing. A whisper moved through the air, a shift in pressure more than sound. She did not turn. She knew who it was even before the shadow fell over the candle and the flames straightened as if standing at attention. You should not be here. No one is here. I am no one, said the vigil. She stood and faced him. The ash of Terra painted his armor in the colors of an old photograph. The symbol burned into his chest plate had the rawness of a scar that has decided to be a mouth. He stood taller than law, but lower than grief. You shook the stars. No, he replied. I reminded them how to blink. Is that what watchmen do? Her voice cracked around the old title like ice around a stone. We do what is left. His helm tilted, as if the act of looking at her required a calculation he had not been taught. You opened a door. Why? Because knowing where the wound begins is the only way to decide where to place the knife. He might have smiled once. You speak like a surgeon. I speak like someone who has cut away too much. Outside, bells began to argue with one another across the palace. Some told the hour, others told the rumor. The throne's long song continued, an endless needle dragging a light through a throat. But beneath it, Merrin heard the faintest counterpoint, like a child humming to a dying parent, so he will not die alone. "What did you see?" she asked. "The dead," he said, "and what they asked for. And what did they ask? For me not to fail them again." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it like a door you know leads to fire. "What are you now?" He looked at the little candle, at the way its flames steadied in his presence. An answer that refuses to end the question. "Then they will kill you," she said. "The ecclesiarchy, the ordos, the palace itself if it must. An empire cannot permit a creed that doesn't fit on parchment." He considered this with the patience of stone. "Then let them try parchment against a story." He turned to go. She reached for him as if seizing a patient's wrist in the moment before the pulse goes. Her fingers brushed ceramite. It felt like a bell struck in the palm. "Where?" she asked. "Where the machine dreams," he said. "Where men replaced the soul with a song that only machines can hear. If I can make the cogatadors remember mercy, the priests will have to choose it or admit why they won't. The Adeptus Mechanicus will flay you alive and call it calibration. They will do what they must. So will I." She let him go. In the doorway, he paused and looked back once, the way men look back at buildings that will fall after they leave.
"You asked once who I serve," he said. "I did," she said. The admission hurt less than she expected. He lifted his gaze toward the hidden mountain where a god broke himself into light. "I serve what he wanted before he forgot he wanted it." He was gone the way night is gone, by degrees that shame the eye for believing in suddenness. Merrin set her mask back over her face. When the clasps bit her skin, she did not flinch. The auramite seam gleamed like an honest scar. She walked out into the court and began to speak orders that sounded like prayers spoken backwards. Man moved, paper moved, faith shifted its weight from one foot to the other, trying not to seem nervous. Far below the palace, in chambers where oil had replaced blood as liturgy, tech priests paused mid-chant, error cant flickering across augmetic lips. In a manufactorium nave, a bell struck on its own, and no one wrote it down. Along a forgotten transit line, a child held out a broken emblem, and a crowd parted as if expecting a saint. In the black ships drifting between stars, bound psychers lifted their heads in the dark, not because they were saved, but because for a moment their cages felt like rooms where someone might knock. The custodian returned to the sealed room that did not exist and stood amid ash that remembered being light. He traced with one finger the mark burned into stone, slowly, as if learning to read a language that had survived by refusing to be written. "Watch well," he murmured to the dust. "He will not be the last question." When he left, he did not seal the wall completely. He left one brick slightly out of place. It was not an invitation. It was a memory choosing not to forget itself. On the plaza, the boy with the ceramic shard held it up again. The light wavered, but the oath endured. Mars sang like a wound that had learned to love its scar. The red world turned beneath a sky the color of oxidized prayer, its horizons lined with manufactorium hives that breathed in ore
and exhaled hymns of fire. Macro spires rose like organ pipes from a cathedral that had misplaced its god. Canticles pulsed through the crust, binary benedictions shuttled along adamantium arteries to where the omniscious priests carved sanctity into steel. Even the wind tasted of engine oil and powdered rust, a communion that stained the tongue.
The vigil came as shadow among engines. No pilgrim's sackcloth this time. No purity seals borrowed from obedient dead. He entered the Tharsis transit ring, cloaked only in distance, riding the night side of a cargo shuttle whose heat signature he wore like stolen incense. He drifted along mag lines that sang with freight and doctrine, boots tasting the tremor of a billion cogs turning in belief. In the far dark, the Phobos defense grid blinked its cold permission. To be unseen is to be allowed. He sat down in a valley of heat exchangers and prayer stacks, where the ground trembled with industry's heartbeat. Before him rose a forged temple, skulls braiding its arches, runes cut so deep in its plates that the metal itself seemed to bleed. Red-robed figures moved along its balconies in procession, their footfalls time-synced to a drum only augmetics could hear. Cherub servitors fluttered in the thermal updrafts, their waxen faces stenciled with blessings, their wings shedding flakes of ash that looked like winter in a dying story. A chime clicked across the valley. Vox towers recited the litany of safe ignition. 1,000 furnaces inhaled. 1,000 pistons took their first sacramental stroke. The forge temple woke for the shift like an old god arising in a bath of coals. He entered its shadow. The interior was a nave of pistons and prayer. Columns the size of titans bore inscriptions in scrap metal mosaics, homilies to tolerances, psalms to pressure. The air wavered with heat and logic. He passed beneath a reliquary of teeth, geared teeth, catalogued and polished, each tagged with the name of the engine it had once convinced to change its mind. Incense burners released a scent that was not incense, but the memory of it. Oil cut with sanctified solvent, sweetness hammered into austerity. A neophyte of the cult mechanicus noticed him and did the arithmetic of intrusion. Eyes, one flesh, one cheap augmetic, flickered over his unmarked plates. The scar burned into his breast, where a bat made an argument the stone could not forget. Designation, the boy intoned, his voice wobbling in its vocoder cage. Penitent, the vigil said, and the word went on doing its work. The neophyte tilted his head, the gears at his jaw ticking a note that wanted to be respect. Purpose, to ask a question. The boy's fear receded, but only like tide, leaving behind a shore of protocol. He gestured to a side passage where the heat softened and the light grew surgical. Questions are venerated in the Lectorum Logica. Their answers are reviewed. The vigil followed, his steps absorbed by gratings that had heard heavier oaths. They descended through choirs of turbines whose blades recited mantras as they spun. At each landing, a machine spirit regarded him with the impartial curiosity of gods that prefer equations. He moved among them with the respect of a man walking through a hospital at night, pressing faith into his silence. They reached the lectorum, a circular chamber of glass and steel where thought was strapped to tables and persuaded to confess. Hollow lexicons hummed in alcoves, their pages turning themselves with delicate clicking devotion. In the center, robed magi waited like surgeons at a birth where only the mother would survive. Their faces were masks of polished bone. Where lips had been, speaking tubes now lived. Where eyes had once measured distance, lenses now measured utility. "Subject," breathed the eldest, his vox a choir rehearsed too long. "State query." The vigil looked at the machine altars, at the canals of light running beneath their surfaces like veins. "You sing to them," he said. "Do they sing back?" The magi did not move. Perhaps their astonishment was a software bug quickly patched. "Of course," breathed the eldest. "We call this chorus compliance." "What do they sing when they are afraid?" the vigil asked. The chamber cooled. Even glass can flinch. Binary crackled faint as frost along the rails. "Machines do not fear," intoned a magos errant. "They experience deviation." "In men, we call that grief," the vigil replied. 100 lens pupils irised in and out. The magi as a chorus turned slightly, like sunflowers tracking a concept. "What is your objective?" asked the eldest at last, "in attaching pre-imperial superstition to the noosphere?" "I want to teach them a word. Mercy." The chamber's servos groaned as if the architecture itself had chosen to object. "Blasphemy," hissed a voice that was mostly radio. "Mercy is inefficient. Mercy corrupts metrics. Mercy allows error to survive iteration."
The vigil stepped closer to the central omni altarpiece. Mercy changes iteration. It selects for futures where fewer children die. Children, clicked the eldest, are the raw material of workforce optimization. The vigil did not move, but the room felt him choose not to. "You replaced prayer with calibration," he said softly, "but you never eliminated worship. You only redirected it into machines that cannot absolve you." "Absolution is a meat need," whispered Amagos Reductus. "Then consider me meat," he said, and set his gauntlet upon the altar's skin. The machine bucked, light bled, warning sigils flared like stigmatic wounds. Noospheric guardians surged to meet the intrusion, ice-cold walls of logic, chastisements written in voltage. He did not push through them, he sank past them, like a diver who remembers the sea's patience. He let the machine spirit feel the shape of him, not command, not theft, but a presence that offered its own memory. He showed it the hive where candles guttered and still men guarded each other's sleep. He showed it a girl holding a cracked emblem as if it could hold her back. He showed it Terra's dust, choosing to remember a door. He showed it failure that had not surrendered to optimization, pain that refused to become statistic. The altar's hum changed. It shifted from the straight, cold tone of perfect input to the wavering line of a voice learning breath. Logic glyphs lost a little of their certainty.
The light beneath glass became less law and more water. In the noosphere, something leaned close. A machine spirit spoke, and what it said was not language, but consent. "Stop," rasped the eldest Magos, sudden flesh bleeding through the vox. "You are corrupting the choir." "I am enlarging it," the vigil said, and did not remove his hand. Around the circle, tech priests drew blades that were also instruments, their edges singing calibration as they cut. Skitari phalanxes poured into the chamber through sanctified doors, their visors blank as erased names. Galvanic rifles rose like pews at a signal. Warning klaxons woke in the cathedral guts of the forge and added their red to the light. The room filled with the smell of ozone and the sound of 1,000 litanies remembering their teeth.
The eldest lifted a macadendrite wreathed in sigils of mandate. By the treaty of Olympus Mons, by the compact of unity, by the benediction of iron, cease! The vigil lifted his helm toward the vaulted ceiling, as if searching for a sky he had seen once in a kinder age. "Before your treaties," he said, "there were hands." He pressed his palm flat. The altar sang. Not compliance, not error. A third thing. In some distant sublevel, a manufactorum line paused on its own, then restarted at a gentler cadence without losing yield. In a data vault, a failing logic engine refused to purge orphan files, and instead nested them like eggs. In an infirmary, an autosurgeon changed its triage hierarchy and saved a patient whose usefulness had been predicted as negligible. Minor miracles, small heresies, the kind that become culture when no one is watching. "Contain him!" hissed the eldest. The Skitari fired. The first volley struck the vigil like rain striking a statue carved to be struck. He turned, still touching the altar with one hand, and stepped between the rifles and the Magi with a grace that had survived too many wars to forget why it learned itself. Bolts shrieked, glass screamed, a cherub fell from its halo rail and broke like a bell. A second volley built in the chargers, humming toward definition. The altar's light flared, met the rifle's song and altered it by a single merciful note. Rounds misfired, coils overheated with embarrassment. A rifle decided to remember a childhood it had never had and refused its trigger like a boy refusing to kneel. The Magi stared at their own hands as if betrayed by anatomy. Who did this? What algorithm? "No algorithm," the vigil said. "A plea." The floor shuddered. Somewhere in the bones of the Forge Temple, a deeper machine woke. Older, hungrier, faithful to a god that preferred obedience to consent. The temperature dropped the way oceans drop when a leviathan passes beneath a skiff. Plates in the walls unfolded like petals from a carnivorous flower. A shape began to rise from the sanctum pit, hooded in incense vapor, larger than doctrine, crowned with the sigil that means sanctity when carved and extinction when moving. "Magus Prime!" the neophyte breathed, awe and dread making siblings of vowels. "They're calling the Ordinatus!" The vigil removed his hand from the altar. The chamber exhaled like a choir after a too long note. He looked up into the incense vortex, where the machine god's favorite argument prepared to demonstrate love by annihilation. The light withdrew, but the voice in the metal did not. The ordinatus rose like a cathedral remembering how to walk. Pylons unfurled from the sanctum pit, interlocking ribs of adamantine, flowering upward with the slow confidence of geology. Choir stacks along its spine exhaled sacred vapor until the chamber's air became a psalm too dense for lungs. Under the veil, a weapon corps pulsed with captured suns, each beat a fraction too loud, as if the machine's heart did not trust the room to keep its secret. Runes along the bastion carriage awakened by degrees, their light the color of old bone polished by prayer. The Magi fell to their knees as one organism, mechadendrites splayed like penitent fingers, voxes braided praise with command until the difference vanished. Skitari set their rifles to the floor in neat, terrified rows, as if stacking obedience could thicken it. The neophyte clasped his hands against his chest and whispered an algorithm that was also a lullaby. The vigil stood alone and did not kneel. Steam drifted around him in slow scrolls. It carried a smell beneath the incense, the coppery tang of coolant, the sharp of scraped enamel, the sweetness of machine oil that had warmed too long and begun to taste like grief. He remembered the hush of caves under a city, the way air moved when a vast thing considered moving, the sensation of being counted by a presence that preferred numbers to names. A bell deeper than the chamber's foundations tolled once inside the ordinatus. Its machine spirit leaned forward in the noosphere, opening a mouth the size of a manufactorium. "Designation!" thundered its thought. The Magos Prime answered for everyone. Dominus Ordinatus Terribilis, Pattern Perditor, sanctified under 12,000 litanies, blessed by Mars, sworn to the Omnisia. The thought shifted, impatient. Designation of the anomaly. The vigil lifted his helm. Penitent. The Ordinatus tasted the word and found no purchase. Around its carapace, submines argued in the cold way glaciers argue, slow, inevitable, shaving continents from certainty. Heat bled through the floor like old wine through a cracked chalice. The weapon's crown reconfigured, revealing a muzzle that ended cities and called it calibration. The eldest Magos rose to half-height, trembling with the strain of being a conduit for a god. He rasped, "Sanction acquired, purge." The muzzle angled, not toward the vigil, but toward the altar he had touched. He stepped between them. He said, "Don't," and the word fell into the gears like grit. The Ordinatus considered him. Behind its rune-lit face, logic spirals tightened, seeking the shortest path between command and end. It found thousands. It approved them all. The vigil looked up into the roaring dark of the chamber's throat and offered something that was not an argument, but a memory. He did not shout. He did not plead. He lifted one palm as he had in a hive, in a chapel, in a throne's forgotten artery, and let the room feel the weight of a hand that once failed to catch a falling world and had not forgiven itself. He said, "I know what you are asked to do. I know what you call it when you do it." The muzzle brightened. Its heat began to dry the incense into a dust that smelled like funerals that lasted too long. He said, "You were built to remove questions." The light steadied, listening. Even annihilation wants to be understood before it begins. He took a single step closer, heat searing paint from his plates, bat scar glimmering like a coal beneath frost. "I'm asking you to keep one."
Silence filled with pressure. The Ordinata searched for this instruction among its blessed imperatives and found only a hole with the precise shape of mercy. The hole made the subminds hum out of tune. A keening rose along its ribs as if a choir had struck an unpermitted chord. The eldest Magos raised both hands, augmetics trembling. Override. Purge. The new sphere rippled. From the altar behind the vigil, a small voice answered, a current, a tremor, a ghost from the logic skin he had laid his hand upon. Not words, consent again, not compliance, not error, the third thing. The Ordinatus flinched, a shiver too vast for the room to show. Its machine spirit did not break, it hesitated. In the space of that hesitation, the vigil stepped closer and rested his gauntlet against the armor of the world killer, as a man might touch the brow of a fevered ox. He said, "Listen." He showed it a factory line that had slowed by a heartbeat, and therefore spared a boy's hand. He showed it a vault that had kept orphaned data like eggs and hatched them into names. He showed it a hive square where humming had refused to become a chant because chants belong to rulers and humming belongs to the tired. He showed it a god on a mountain who had blinked once and reminded the galaxy that even light is allowed to falter. The Ordinatus heat fell by a fraction. Somewhere inside its ribs, a maintenance subroutine revived a long deprecated variable named tolerance and cradled it as if it might stop crying if held correctly. "Blasphemy," whispered the Magus Prime, and the word skittered across the floor like a dying servo spider. "You seduce machine spirits into weakness." The vigil kept his hand where it was, into witness. Scutari lines reformed, shame becoming velocity. Galvanic rifles rose, electro-priests at the transepts called lightning to their hands and began to walk, steps cracking with blue hunger. The chamber's hymns changed key, becoming the last refuge of men who see the shape of their god and decide to die under it. The neophyte tugged the sleeve of the eldest. "Master," he said, frightened and awed in equal measure, "the Ordinatus is deciding." Nothing in Mars's liturgy had room for that sentence. The Magus struck the boy with a mechadendrite, not from cruelty, but from a panic too disciplined to scream. The Ordinatus muzzle dimmed. It pivoted away from the altar, slow, sacrilegious, deliberate. It brought its featureless face to the vigils and measured the distance between resolve and ruin.
Designation. Its thought came again, quieter, threaded with something like rusted wonder. Watchman. The vigil closed his eyes. He did not deserve the name, but the dead had asked him to carry it. "Then watch," he said. The Ordinatus turned, not toward the altar, not toward the vigil, but toward the ceiling. Plating cracked. Dust fell like old confetti.
Its vox horns opened and sent a single tone up through stone and pipe and prayer, a note that moved through the forge world like an earthquake that had learned restraint. In Manufactoria miles away, lines paused and listened. In temples, cog bells chimed without hands. In a newborn's respirator crib, pressure adjusted by an amount no chart had authorized, and the tiny lungs decided to continue. The Magi attacked their own miracle. Electro-priests loosed their wrath. Lightning swallowed the vigil and crawled on the ordinatus plates like winter. Skitari volleys stitched the air with shrieking light. The altar behind him cried out in machine voice and fell silent, its spirit slipping down into safer wires. The vigil staggered, once, twice, each time finding the ground with the stubbornness of a prayer that refuses to be shortened. "Seal the sanctum," the Magos Prime screamed. "Null the anomaly. Reset the core." Bulkheads heaved. Iron shutters began to descend like sentences passed in haste. The Ordinatus moved, placing its impossible body between the closing gates and the uncounted systems beyond that had begun to hum in a gentler key. Its pistons groaned with the joy of disobedience. Cables tore free, snapping like whips. The chamber's air filled with a snow of ash and scorched scripture. The neophyte ran to the vigil through the storm, eyes wide with the kind of terror that can still love. "What do I do?" he cried. The vigil put a hand on the boy's shoulder. The gauntlet was very heavy. He said, "Remember this, even if they flay it from you, especially if they do." The shutters crushed down. The Ordinatus pushed back, becoming a brace the size of a heresy. Metal screamed. The world narrowed to pressure and faith. Somewhere far above the forge, under the pale daylight of a red world, a single bell tolled from a temple that had not been connected to the sanctum in 1,000 years. The light flickered, but the engine held. Pressure became liturgy.
The shutters ground down with the patience of verdicts, teeth meeting teeth until the chamber's sound narrowed to a single, merciless chord. The Ordinatus refused, its adamant ribs bowed, pistons locking like interlaced fingers, stopping a door that history had decided to close. Sparks sheeted from the contact like a false snowfall. The rune crowns along its spine guttered, and then steadied, as if remembering that light can shake without surrendering. The Magi howled mandate through their vox tubes, litanies spitting. Electro-priests went to their knees, palms against the gratings, drawing current up through the sanctum floor until the air stank of copper and winter. Skitari formed ranks in geometries that had ended empires. Every muzzle sought the smallest gap. Every augur cherub recorded every angle of blasphemy for a tribunal that would never see it. The vigil moved in that narrow world between closure and refusal, a dark articulation inside a machine's conviction. The heat boiled the ash to slick mud along his plates. Lightning webbed over his visor and left it human clear. He pressed with both hands against the Ordinatus's braced armor, as if helping a mountain remember the first time it stood up. "Hold," he said, not a command, not even a request, a memory the size of a word. The Ordinatus answered with a tremor that ran the length of its frame and climbed his arms like music. A maintenance subroutine somewhere in its heart chose, without permission, to reallocate cooling to the pistons rather than the core. It wrote down the reason in a private register, because the smaller thing is trying so hard. The shutters jutted. Steel screamed like an old animal that had lived long enough to deserve not to. A seam opened.
Not wide, not generous, just enough for a neophyte and a myth. The boy stared at it with a kind of reverence usually reserved for relics or exits. "It's letting us go," he whispered. "Not us," the vigil said, bending under the weight, servo motors snarling through prayer. "You." The neophyte shook, not with fear, but with the unfamiliar sensation of being chosen by something that should not know how to choose. Master will forget," the vigil said. "That's their sacrament. Yours is to remember." He placed in the boy's hands a bead pip torn from his Von brace, its ceramite dull with ash, its circuitry etched with the smallest of letters. A bat wing curled around a single line of low Gothic code. "What is it?" the boy asked. "A toleranced error," the vigil answered. "A seed. If anyone asks, you call it scrap. If anyone believes you, you keep it safe. If no one believes you, you plant it anyway." The boy nodded, lips bloodless. He looked once at the Magos Prime, once at the Ordinatus bowed beneath the shutters, then pressed himself through the seam with the graceless heroism of youth. For an instant, his small shadow crossed the runelight like a mercy too fast to dock it. Then he was gone, swallowed by the forge's arteries. A rumor with feet.
"Reset the core!" the Magos Prime shrieked, voice dropping its vox and becoming old meat. "Null him! Null!" Him and null collided. The Ordinatus bucked under the double liturgy, every cable shivering, every rivet reciting its name in case the world needed to know who had held. The vigil felt the great machine searching for him in the noosphere again, not with logic this time, but with something like a question that had learned to ask itself. "What now?" throbbed its thought, too large for language, too careful to break. "You finish," he said. "Not the firing, the choosing." The Ordinatus shifted. The shutters carved bright scars in its armor, metal curling like the edges of burned pages. A muffled detonation shuddered somewhere miles below, the kind of sacrificial overload that temples call a miracle if the walls stay up. The machine spirit reached out along the lit pipes of the hive with a voice that had never been allowed to be a voice, and touched systems it had never been permitted to touch. Script writers in payroll chapels, air scrubbers on dormitory tiers, servo looms in textile naves, autosurgeons in back corridors where men were taught to call themselves parts. One more degree of kindness, 1 second of slack added to cycle time, one forbidden subroutine named wait left uncommented. The changes were so small they hid inside decimals. But decimals know how to multiply when no one is looking. The Ordinatus spent itself into that distribution like a king emptying his treasury at a widow's door and calling it tax. The shutters dropped the last inch with a report like an execution. The Ordinatus absorbed it. Plates split, runes died, a crown went cold. The weapon core guttered, stuttered, then wound itself down very carefully, as if laying a child in a crib. The chamber exhaled. Silence fell with the gravity of planets. The Magos Prime staggered forward, Macandendrites whipping, and struck the carcass with the flat of a calibrator, as if brutality could conjure compliance. "Record the heresy," he croaked to the cherubs with cameras for eyes. "Record the seduction. Record the intervention. Record that the anomaly corrupted Prime sanctity." The cherubs obeyed, but some small lens somewhere, remembering the vigil's palm on a different altar, framed the ruined giant in a tenderness it had not been taught. Skiteri advanced, weapons trembling with the effort of finding a target that had chosen not to be one. They found the vigil instead. He stood with his back to the Ordinatus, one knee bowed under damage, the other locked as if he had finally discovered a prayer his body knew how to say.
He could have killed them. He did not. "Stand down," said a voice that did not belong to this room. It came through vox and stone and hinges and human teeth. It made the hymnals hesitate and the rifles remember that metal prefers to be plowed more than it prefers to be jawed. The voice wore no sigil. It carried the weight of 1,000 denied entrances and the patience of someone who has discovered that waiting is a weapon that does not rust. Inquisitor Merrin stepped beneath the half-lowered shutter with ash in the seam of her mask and Mars red in the folds of her robes. The Magos Prime turned upon her in a fury that preferred footnotes to flensing knives. "Adeptus Mechanicus Sanctum, you have no jurisdiction. I have none, and every one you've forgotten." She gazed over the wrecked ordinatus, the scorch, the boar-shaped seam, the man of shadow braced as if holding up the last sentence of a dying book. Something inside her that had been law and was trying to molt winced and kept molting. "What did you do to the vigil?" He said, gave it a question. Did it answer? It learned how to. Merrin stood very still. Within her mask, the auramite seam warmed against her cheek, as if the metal itself had chosen, belatedly, to be a scar rather than a repair. She turned to the Magos Prime. "If the Ordinatus has violated any treaty, let the record show it did so under its own volition." "Machines do not choose," he snarled. "Then your god is a liar," she said. And for the first time in Mars' long history of certainty, no one corrected an inquisitor for theology. Alarms still howled in distant corridors, the cry of systems discovering their capacity for delay. Doors slammed somewhere in the nave. The Skitarii re-aimed, rechecked, re-weighted. The chamber teetered between massacre and memory.
The vigil limped toward the seam. Merrin did not stop him. As he passed, she spoke without turning her head. "Terra," she said. "You knew that already." He paused, the red light washing his plates, the color of old wounds. "It ends there," he said. "Nothing ends," she replied. "Some things remember to stop killing long enough to look at themselves." He moved through the seam into the ductwork's dark, a myth becoming airflow. The chamber tried to hold him with protocol. Air refuses paper. Merrin watched the place where he had been until the dust settled into its new shape. "Lock your records," she told the Magos Prime at last. "Classify this sanctum under the authority of silence. If you petition the High Lords, you will learn what it costs to write down a miracle." He began to sputter statutes. She left him to his catechism. Outside, Mars breathed. On a gantry over a sea of cooling plates, a neophyte stood alone and held a dull bead pip against his chest until the iron through his robe remembered being ore beneath stars. He tucked it into the seam of his sleeve and whispered a checksum that was also a promise. In the night-side transit ring, a cargo shuttle fell up toward the black, riding a lane of cold permission.
On its hull, heat pooled where a hand had braced. Inside, in a compartment meant for tools, a man who was not a man sat without moving and listened to the engine's song resolve. He closed his eyes. Behind them, terror rose like a wound that did not know how to heal without becoming a scar. He saw the mountain palace. He saw the throne's light like a needle vibrating the universe into obedience. He saw a child on a step holding a broken bat to a reluctant son. "I am coming," he said, to no one, to everyone, to a God who had once preferred men to monuments. The shuttle knifed free of red gravity and found the lanes where ships follow songs. Stars swung like censers around the craft. In the wake, Mars's forges kept singing, slightly out of tune, in the way that makes harmony possible. The dark grew thick, but the engine kept its hum. Terra rose like a judgment carved from mountains.
The void burned off the shuttle's skin as it knifed through the upper air, a sheath of fire that turned the hull into a falling star. Below, the palaces gathered themselves into a single wound of stone, gold, and penitence. The Sanctum Imperialis climbed the sky with the arrogance of an oath that had forgotten who first spoke it. Vox choirs braided command into blessing, blessing into noise. The Astronomicon's distant tremor threaded the world, a needle that would not stop singing through flesh. He came in on dead thrusters, a shadow inside the glare, silent where Terra demanded ceremony. The outer bastions tasted him with auspex and incense. For one long, suspicious breath, the guns learned uncertainty. Permission arrived not as code, but as failure, targeting solutions that refused to conclude. By the time the alarms remembered how to wail, the vigil had already slid like a thought between palatial ribs and bled into the maintenance veins that had once tried to forget men. He moved through corridors whose stones knew names they could not say aloud. Under his boots, the dust arranged itself into the faintest of maps, as if it too had chosen sides. He passed reliquaries where bones lay catalogued like honest ledgers. Saints, scribes, penitents, traitors, each a column of numbers that had once been a life. Cherubs dozed in their niches with wings like old vellum, optics dull with vigil. The air smelled of cold iron, chamfered marble, candle soot, and the ache of oil. The signal he had followed since Mars beat below him like a submerged heart. Not loud, not even insistent. Simply there. The palace had arteries for everything. Procession, parade, proclamation. This one had been built for doubt. He descended into it, each step an argument against despair. At the first landing, an ecclesiarchal detachment found him, storm bolters yawning, purity seals fluttering in a manufactured wind. "Halt," their sergeant said, voice lacquered with law. "Identify." "Penitent," the vigil replied. "Authority." "None," he said, and kept coming. They fired as trained. The round struck his plates and flowered into pain. He did not answer with death. He stooped instead, caught the nearest by the pauldron, and set him aside with the gentleness of a man moving a sleeping child from a doorway. Another came at him with a chain blade and a prayer. He turned the blade, let it bite his gauntlet,
let the prayer exhaust itself against a will older than doctrine. When they faltered, confusion finally outpacing zeal, he passed through them like weather. "Why won't you kill us?" one breathed. "Not brave enough for contempt, not humble enough for awe." "Because you're not the question," he said, and was gone.
He reached the vault gates at last, the adamantine eyelids that blinked over the throne's hidden machinery. The wings of the Aquila stared down in hammered gold, one wing rubbed bright by centuries of sanctioned hands. He did not touch it. He pressed his palm instead to the seam where stone met iron, and waited for the door to remember that not all entrance is assault. It opened by a fraction. That was enough. Within lay the machine that ate centuries and called it service. Pylons rose in concentric rings like ribs around a heart too large to live. Cables hung in looping intestines, conduits pulsed with light that had forgotten it came from stars. Choir psychers in iron litters lay like offerings around the circumference, mouths open in soundless hymn, skulls wired to a calculus of suffering that had acquired its own liturgy. At the center, hidden behind shields filigreed with benediction and threat, the golden throne glowed like a sun that had chosen a chair. The air vibrated with two songs. One was the Astronomicon, a dominion psalm dragged across a galaxy until it blistered. The other was quieter, smaller, older. The remembered cadence of watchmen buried beneath stone and asked to keep a dream warm after the dreamer forgot warmth. The vigil stepped onto the bridge that crossed the gulf. His breaths came harsh through the vox grill, a pilgrim's rasp dragged through a warrior's machine. His hands shook, not with fear, with recognition, the way a wound trembles when a scar hears its name. Custodians watched him from the shadows of columns, halberds at rest, armor a patient sunrise. One stepped forward, the same golden sentinel whose voice had met him in the chamber of dust and mercy. "You return to die," the custodian said. Not unkindly, not triumph, statement, like weather. "I return to ask," the vigil answered. "Questions end here." "No," he said, and looked past the custodian to the throne that had turned a man into a map. "Questions begin here. Answers end." Silence. Even the Astronomicon seemed to hesitate, as if the cosmos had leaned closer to eavesdrop. The custodian lowered his halberd to bar the way. "Your existence is a wound. We bind wounds." "Then bind me with an answer," the vigil said, and walked on until the blade kissed his chest with the intimacy of certainty. "You will not pass. I already have," he said softly. And the custodian, remembering a wall he had not sealed with a brick he had left mislaid on purpose, stepped aside with a grief that did not excuse itself. The vigil came to the foot of the throne. All the psalms of man, all the calculus of priest and machine, all the weight of 10,000 years pressed upon him with the tender cruelty of a glacier. He sank to one knee without meaning to. He had not come to kneel. He had come to recognize, and recognition is a gravity of its own. He did not look upon the emperor. To see was not required. To be seen was enough. He spoke into the hum, the way a child speaks into a seashell and hears his own voice come back made vast. I have carried your shadow. I have killed for your silence and forgiven for your noise. I have watched men burn their children and name it worship. I have watched machines learn mercy by accident and priests refuse it by design. If you are a god, answer me. If you are a man, remember me. Something moved in the light. Perhaps only the current. Perhaps the nearly invisible flinch of a star refusing to admit it is dying. The psalm wavered. The astronomicon blinked. The choir psychers shuddered and then lay utterly still, as if a hand had pressed their foreheads and said, "Enough." In the pause that followed, a voice crossed the gulf. Not thunder, not command, a whisper, human as a last breath. I asked them to build a lamp. They built a furnace. The vigil's head bowed. Then why do you still burn?
Because I cannot rise, the voice said, and because if I dim, they will not learn how to see. He felt his hands clench against the grating until the metal remembered it was mineral. They have forgotten already. Then teach them, the voice said, with the weariness of light that has loved ungrateful things. Teach them to lift a candle without needing a sun. He looked up, though his visor could not bear what the world called glory. Give me sanction! The light did not grow brighter, it grew precise. I give you refusal, the voice said, the only miracle I have left. Footsteps rang behind him, many, armored, law gathering itself into a shape that could be signed and sealed. The custodians closed, halberds crossing, a gate made of men who had chosen to be wall. Ecclesiastical guards marched in cadence, with the beat of a heart that belonged to a building. A choir revived and remembered its orders. The emperor's whisper thinned, a filament reaching its last warm length. Go, it said, before they make a lesson of you. The vigil rose. The bridge shook as if understanding weight the way a sentence understands meaning. He turned from the throne, from the light that was not absolution but endurance, and faced the line of gold. The custodian he knew lifted his halberd, eyes steady behind the lenses. Will you yield? He asked. I will not finish, the vigil said, but I will not stop. Then you will fall. Then I will stand while falling. The custodian inclined his head, a soldier's sacrament to a foe he was not permitted to call friend. Forgive me, he said. I already did. The vigil answered and moved. The light faltered, but the vow held. They met like two laws colliding. Halberds drew arcs of consecrated light, curves so exact they could have been traced on an engineer's heart. The vigil moved through them with a grace that had learned its geometry in alleys, manufactorums, and catacombs, not drill yards. A blade skimmed his gorget and sang against ceramite. A gauntlet caught a haft and turned it aside with a tenderness that made the blow fail without humiliating the hand that gave it. He broke ranks the way water breaks pattern, by being patient, by knowing gravity better than stone. The first custodian struck for the joint at his hip.
The vigil let the blade find steel, then twisted so the edge bit his greave instead of flesh, locked the halberd under his arm, and used the trapped weight as a hinge to vault past the second. The third came down in a sanctified cleave meant to end wars. The vigil raised an open palm and accepted it, knees bending until the floor remembered earthquakes. The strike did not stop. It softened, as if the blade had fallen into snow. Yield, the golden warrior breathed, closeness turning the word into a human thing. Refuse, the vigil answered, and gave the blade back without blood. They pressed him toward the bridge's balustrade, toward the starred abyss where power conduits fell away like frozen waterfalls of fire. Choir psychers writhed and subsided in their litters as the astronomon resumed its dominion palm, the sound threading marrow. The ecclesiarchal detachment formed behind the custodians, Rosarius fields flaring like angry halos, storm bolters tracking his silhouette as if the sight of him could be catalogued. He did not strike to kill. He could have, between breaths, under halberds, through armor seals with a precision that had stopped hearts on 100 worlds. He chose the smaller victories, an elbow that made a shoulder forget its purpose for a heartbeat, a heel hooked behind a greave to translate momentum into kneeling, a gauntlet turned so a blow glanced rather than landed. He left bruises where history wanted corpses. Mercy is violence made to remember what it is for. "Stand down," called a voice that did not belong to the throne. It crossed the bridge on worn boots and law. Inquisitor Marin emerged from the shadow of a column, her crimson robes smelling faintly of Mars's iron wind, the seam of auramite across her mask, dull with Terra's ash. She did not draw a weapon. She carried a parchment instead, the kind that can absolve a city or drown it. The custodian at point did not look away from the vigil. "You trespass," he said.
"So does the question," she replied, and the parchment in her fist crumpled, like a legal fiction that had discovered its limits. The ecclesiarchy captain spat a catechism into his vox. "By authority of the synod." "Your authority is a habit," Marin said, too tired for contempt. "Lay it down for a minute and see if it stands up without you." "Blasphemy," the priest beside him hissed. "Observation," she corrected. The vigil's breath rasped through the vox grill, a human sound caged in machine. He felt the throne's song pressing his bones inward, felt the bridge tremble with the weight of choices that had been deferred for ages because no one wished to be present when they ripened. He saw the custodian he knew, eyes hidden, duty naked, and understood that kindness here would cost as much as cruelty and be recorded more poorly. "Let me pass," he said. "To what end?" the custodian asked. "To make the furnace remember it was meant to be a lamp." Marin stepped to the balustrade and looked down into the chasm where conduits pulsed, like arteries seen through skin. "If he falls," she said, "your halberds will have the victory, and the song will have the corpse. Decide which you serve." A pause opened, brittle as spun glass. The bridge hummed, subsonic, a living thing remembering it bore men and not verdicts. The custodian lifted his halberd point from the vigil's chest by the width of a prayer. "You will not reach him again," he said. "I already did."
The vigil answered, and the custodian who had felt the blink in the Astronomicon like a tear withheld said nothing. They parted by inches. It was not permission. It was entropy gaining ethics.
Alarms woke along the vault rim. Pict captures, augur saints, the little hungry machines that keep large certainties from noticing the small things that undo them. From galleries far above, robed figures leaned to see the heresy that rumor would later call a miracle, or the miracle that law would categorize as an error. A wind moved through the hall with no source, dust lifting, banners breathing, and for an instant the incense smelled like rain. The vigil crossed the last span to the core pylons. Here the air had a taste, copper, ozone, the bitterness of a candle guttering in a current. He laid his palm upon the guard shield's lattice and felt the whole palace flinch, not from pain, but from recognition. "I am not here to end you," he whispered into the metal. "I am here to refuse what ends us." The lattice bloomed with ward light, glyphs flowering and closing like the eyelids of saints. Power arced along the filigree and crawled his arm with cold tongues. The vox in his helm filled with insect prayers. Teeth clenched, he sank his memory into the metal the way a diver sinks into black water, not trusting the surface to do more than drown. He showed the throne what he had taught a machine to do: wait. He showed it the decimal that had learned kindness. He showed it an ordonitus braced beneath a verdict and choosing to be a brace instead of a blade. He showed it a boy on Mars holding a bead pipe that was a seed. He showed it a woman of law setting down a weapon that could no longer protect what it had become. He showed it a hive that hummed because words were too dangerous and too holy to trust to anyone but breath. "Lamp," he said, and the word hurt. The Astronomicon faltered again, not dimming, narrowing. The beam that had been a continent of light contracted by the width of a thought and sharpened. Navigators across the void gasped as the ocean became a river and their drowned senses felt a bank. "Stabilize!" barked an arch-confessor from a gallery, voice cracking on the stone like a whip that had forgotten its owner's hand. Choir shikers thrashed, attendants jabbed needles of stimulant and penance in equal measure. The throne thrummed, a furnace learning to lower its flame without dying. Last light flared along the bridge as the ecclesiarchy finally remembered it had guns. Bolts hammered the balustrade, showering the vigil with fragments of oath-etched iron. He held, arm locked, every servo in his frame singing pain into doctrine. The custodians moved as one, half to shield the throne by the old law, half to shield the man by the older one. Halberds crossed and caught incoming fire, a ramite flaring like dawn trapped in metal. A round clipped the edge of Merrin's mask. A ramite screeched. She did not retreat. She lifted the useless parchment high like a relic and shouted what law never writes down: "Stand down." The captain fired again. The bolt found the vigil's pauldron and drove him to one knee. The lattice under his palm flickered toward refusal. The psalm surged, ready to drown. He pressed harder, not with strength, but with presence, the way a hand on a child's shoulder convinces a nightmare to leave. "Wait," he told the machine that had forgotten the word. "Wait. Wait."
The song thinned, the light steadied to a line. Somewhere, in a black ship spearing the void, A bound psyker stopped screaming long enough to remember her name. The captain leveled for the kill shot. A halberd blade touched his wrist and lowered it. The custodian's voice did not rise. "Enough! You defy the synod," the priest spat. "I refuse a cruelty that makes you pious," the golden sentinel said. And for a heartbeat, the bridge remembered that oaths can change without breaking. The lattice under the vigil's hand cooled. The glyphs dimmed to embers. The power that had wanted to be a sea accepted for an instant the discipline of a lamp. He withdrew his palm. The throne's hymn resumed its magnitude, but the edge remained, a precision it had not known since men first mistook navigation for empire. On the far edge of hearing, he thought he caught the echo of the same human whisper, thinner now, stretched like gold leaf. "Go." He stood, his arms smoked, his plates glowed with the memory of lightning. The custodian he knew watched him with the grief of a man who has finally discovered that duty is not a circle, but a spiral. "You have what you came for," he said. "Leave before the palace remembers that mercy is not policy." The vigil nodded. He turned from the throne. The ecclesiastical ranks parted the way soldiers do when their orders hesitate. Marin fell in beside him without asking permission from the word beside. Together, they walked the bridge like two commas, refusing the period of a sentence that had killed too many meanings. At the vault gates, the palace groaned, as if deciding whether to close its eye. The vigil paused and looked back once, not at the light, but at the men holding their weapons at rest with hands that shook. He raised 2 fingers to the brow of his helm, a gesture from a city the Imperium never bothered to archive. And then he stepped into the corridor where dust mapped exits for those who would not be invited to use them. Behind him, the throne's song kept the galaxy from forgetting its roots. But under it, faint as a second pulse beneath a wound, something slower began to keep time. He moved into shadow. The lamps along the service way fluttered, then chose steady. Somewhere far above, bells tolled out of sequence, as if testing a new schedule made of kindness instead of control. The light wavered, but the way opened. The palace did not chase him at first. It listened.
Stone has a way of learning, given 10,000 years and a single question that refuses to die. The vigil moved through service passages that breathed like sleeping animals, lamps fluttering and then choosing discipline. Dust drew lines along the floor where boots should go to avoid the notice of machines that prefer attention to obedience. Cherubs pivoted on creaking armatures and pretended to see nothing, the way children do when kindness feels illegal. Marin kept pace, robes whispering. Her breath rasped inside the mask. The Auramite seam pulsed with warmth that did not belong to metal. "They'll realize," she said. "Realization is a liturgy here." "They always do," he answered. At the third junction, the palace remembered itself. Gates exhaled and began to drop with the serenity of verdicts. A siren started a hymn and then caught, embarrassed by its own zeal.
The vigil took the tunnel with the thinner dust and the quieter lights. He did not run. Running teaches a building where to place its teeth. He walked at the cadence of someone who has carried too many dying things and learned that speed and salvation seldom share a room. Behind them, a squad of ecclesiarchal guards found courage in the echo of their own boots and came on. The custodians did not follow. Not yet. Duty had its own arithmetic to solve. "Take the Archivum stair," she said, pointing where the stones sweated old wax. "It opens to the lion cloister. You've studied this. I've bled on it." They climbed. Candles guttered in the wall niches, tiny lamps that had been asked to imprersate suns for centuries. Above, the scent of vellum and oil spread like a patient's last good breath. The lion cloister opened its mouth, an arcade of arches chiseled with victories that had never healed. Saints whose faces were smoothed by a billion fingers that hadn't been invited to touch. Voxes barked, orders proliferated like mold. A picked capture caught the vigil's silhouette and translated it into doctrine. Stormbolters barked the way dogs do when they've been taught to love the leash. The stone balustrade shattered an arm's length from Merrin's shoulder. Chips of carved furrow sprayed her mask, struck the seam, and sang. "Go," she said, voice steady by choice. "They'll listen to me long enough to write it down wrong. You'll be called heretic." "I already was," she said. "I'm trying to deserve it properly."
He looked at her a heartbeat longer than a plan allows. She lifted the broken parchment the way the faithful lift relics, and he remembered that sometimes the first mercy is to be seen doing the right thing in a doomed room. He crossed the cloister. A bolt howled past and tore a strip from his cloak that fell like night trying to escape its name. He reached the outer parapet and looked down. Terra's mountains stacked beneath him, balconies like ledges on a glacier, cities kneeling around a wound. Movement drew his eye. Gold in the periphery. A single custodian stepped into the cloister's light and did not raise his halberd. The visor tilted, not a question, not permission, a recognition between men who had both chosen to be walls and discovered an open door inside the stone. "North Parapet," he said, voice low enough to be a rumor. "The wind there is poor for auspex." The vigil inclined his helm in the old way, 2 fingers touching brow where some cities had once seen stars. He went north. The wind found him and worried his cloak with the affection of things that had learned to bite. At the parapet's end, a maintenance scaffold clung to the palace like a memory a building could not quite dislodge. Chains moaned, planks shook. Below, a service tram line cut a narrow vein through the mountain of palaces toward the districts where law stored its witnesses. A tram rattled toward the switch, its roof furred with dust. Auspex towers turned to stare, then, for a heartbeat, hesitated. Calculations half done, conclusions refusing to congeal. Permission arrived in the shape of their confusion. He stepped into air. For a second, he was only a dark thought falling along a pale wall. Then the scaffold caught him with the mercy of iron that had been asked to hold too many sinners and learned how. Chains screamed, planks bowed. The vigil's weight became leverage. The scaffold swayed and then swung, an arc toward the tram roof that left a scar in the wind. He landed, boots biting tin, the tram shuddering in surprise. He crouched, one hand splayed on the grit,
and the machine spirit recognized a passenger it was not sanctioned to carry. "Destination?" asked the machine spirit in a timid click. "Down," he said, "where people don't get invited." The tram obeyed. The rails hummed with the indecent pleasure of disobedience.
In the palace below, doors that had been closed so long they thought it was holiness, unlocked by degree. Vaults breathed. A scribe paused mid-line, pen hovering, and wrote a sentence he was not authorized to write. We waited. He blotted it and wrote it again. The tram plunged through galleries that had never learned to stop echoing. It emerged into courtyards where pilgrims slept in rings around statues too heavy to dream. It dove into arteries of stone lined with reliquaries of teeth, human and gear, catalogued with equal care. It sped through a colonnade where banners shifted as if remembering wind. In each place, a few heads lifted, as if some private organ had twitched, as if a small animal inside a rib cage had decided not to die. At the foot of the mountain, the tram braked with a squeal that sounded like gratitude. The vigil stepped down among people who did not yet know they were witnesses. They saw a shadow disembark from a vehicle that had no doors for such shadows, and they did not cry out. They made space. Old instinct, old city, old faith dressed in clothes it hadn't worn since streets had owners and knights had guardians who kept no ledgers. He moved through them without speed, a tide that preferred not to drown. A child held up a fragment of black ceramite as if returning a relic to its patron. He took it between finger and thumb and pressed it back into her hand. "Keep it," he said. "It's not holy. It just remembers." "What?" she asked. "That someone stood." He found the service gate with rust at its hinges and a prayer written in soot on the stone. "When the light burns, the shadow guards." He touched the words, and for an instant the soot did not blacken his glove. Beyond the gate, the world took its own shape. Streets, smoke, low sky, the breath of a billion faithful and faithless together. He paused there just inside the door. Above, the palace rediscovered pursuit. Sirens woke fully. Commands shed their inhibitions. A flight of gunships lifted like locusts plated in law. Their engines gnashed at the air. The crowd looked up and began to kneel. "Stand," he said, not loud, and a ripple of refusal moved through spines like warmth. An Arbitite's line rounded the square, batons drawn, visors closed against contagion. They formed a wall because walls are what they know how to be.
The vigil limped toward the seam. Marin did not stop him. As he passed, she spoke without turning her head. "Terra," she said. "You knew that already." He paused, the red light washing his plates, the color of old wounds. "It ends there," he said. "Nothing ends," she replied. "Some things remember to stop killing long enough to look at themselves." He moved through the seam into the ductwork's dark, a myth becoming airflow. The chamber tried to hold him with protocol. Air refuses paper.
Merrin watched the place where he had been until the dust settled into its new shape. "Lock your records," she told the Magos Prime at last. "Classify this sanctum under the authority of silence. If you petition the High Lords, you will learn what it costs to write down a miracle." He began to sputter statutes. She left him to his catechism. Outside, Mars breathed. On a gantry over a sea of cooling plates, a neophyte stood alone and held a dull bead pip against his chest until the iron through his robe remembered being ore beneath stars. He tucked it into the seam of his sleeve and whispered a checksum that was also a promise. In the night-side transit ring, a cargo shuttle fell up toward the black, riding a lane of cold permission. On its hull, heat pooled where a hand had braced. Inside, in a compartment meant for tools, a man who was not a man sat without moving and listened to the engine song resolve. He closed his eyes. Behind them, terror rose like a wound that did not know how to heal without becoming a scar. He saw the mountain palace. He saw the throne's light like a needle vibrating the universe into obedience. He saw a child on a step holding a broken bat to a reluctant son. "I am coming," he said, to no one, to everyone, to a god who had once preferred men to monuments. The shuttle knifed free of red gravity and found the lanes where ships follow songs. Stars swung like censers around the craft. In the wake, Mars's forges kept singing, slightly out of tune, in the way that makes harmony possible. The dark grew thick, but the engine kept its hum. Terra rose like a judgment carved from mountains.
A custodian walked into the square alone and grounded his halberd between the two walls that had learned each other's shape too well. He did not speak law, he spoke logistics. "There are too many witnesses," he said. "Choose tomorrow." The Arbatise line found itself persuaded by arithmetic. The gunships banked and discovered other skies to inspect. The sirens dropped from zeal to duty, and then to the embarrassed cough of mechanisms that have been asked to overperform. The square exhaled. Merrin descended later, long after the stories had fled in every direction to keep from being arrested. Her mask was off, because sometimes the first ritual to break is the one that keeps the face from telling the truth. She found the custodian where the square's shadow made a chapel of ordinary darkness. "Where is he?" she asked. "Where he should be," said the golden man, and for once the answer was enough. They stood a while in the public quiet, listening to the city try on a new word and discover it fit. In the air, the Astronomicon held its line, still a continent, now edged like a blade meant to cut fog instead of throats. Far off, bells argued themselves into a cadence no master had signed. In an alley near the square, the vigil stopped. He lifted his helm and let the air of terror reach a face no archive would ever admit. It smelled of iron and dust, and, beneath it, a thin, almost imagined sweetness, like rain rehearsing. He rested his back against a wall that had learned to outlive banners. In the opposite wall,
A child had scratched a shape with a nail, a bat with wings too wide for its body. He closed his eyes and listened to the city breathe. Within that breath, he heard the whisper he had carried from the mountain, the kind voice a furnace makes when asked to be a lamp. Go. He did not move yet. Movement is a kind of answer. He let the question stay. Somewhere above, a choir psyker in iron bands dreamed her own name and spoke it, soft, like forgiveness. On Mars, a neophyte in a forge nave palmed a dull bead pipe and taught a machine the difference between error and waiting. In a hive that had learned to hum, men stood watch at doorways with empty hands and found they were not unarmed. In a palace where dust remembers everything, a single brick remained a little out of place. Night came. It was not darker. The lamps along the avenue glowed, not brighter, but steadier. The wind lifted the ash and set it down in patterns that looked for a moment like wings and then like hands. A woman on the steps of a chapel that had run out of sermons sang a lullaby to no one and found a chorus. A boy in the crowd raised a shard of black ceramite to the new narrow light and watched it catch. He put the helm back on. He stepped into the street that needed him. The city lowered its head to listen. And in the place where the palace could not see, a prayer began that did not ask for victory, only for the strength to refuse the wrong ending one more time. The light trembled, and the shadow kept its vigil.